What Do the Lonely Do at Christmas? A sweet African-American romance novella written by Imani Price, narrated by Shatrice Williams and Michael Evans. Chapter 1. The morning light fell through the east-facing window in a cascade of gold, painting warm stripes across the hardwood floor. Grace Holloway stood in the doorway and let herself imagine it. A white crib against the far wall, a rocking chair in the corner, a mobile of soft fabric stars turning slowly in the sunlight. She could almost hear the music box melody, almost smell the baby powder sweetness. "Oh," Elise Henderson breathed beside her. "Oh, Louis." Louis Henderson stood behind his wife with his hands jammed deep in his pockets, wearing the expression Grace had come to recognize after 8 years in real estate, the quiet terror of a man watching his entire life rearrange itself into something new and permanent and terrifying and wonderful. "The light," Elise said, pressing her hand flat against the wall as if she could absorb the warmth of it. "It's perfect. It's exactly what I pictured." "Southern exposure," Grace said, keeping her voice professionally pleasant even as something twisted beneath her ribs. "You'll get this glow every morning, and the window's double-paned, so it stays cozy in winter." Elise turned to her husband. Her eyes were wet. Her hand drifted to her stomach, still flat, but not for much longer, Grace suspected, and Louis's expression softened into something raw and reverent. "We need to talk about it," Elise said, but the words were a formality. Grace could already see the nursery taking shape in her mind. Pale yellow walls, a hand-painted name above the crib, a family growing into these rooms like roots finding water. "Of course," Grace said. "Take all the time you need. I'm here whenever you're ready." She meant it. She always meant it. This was the gift of her work, bearing witness to beginnings, to the moment when a house stopped being a collection of rooms and became the container for someone's future. The Hendersons would paint this nursery together, probably arguing about colors, probably ending up with something neither of them originally wanted, but both of them loved. They'd bring their baby home to this room. They'd stand in this doorway at 3 a.m., exhausted and overwhelmed and incandescently happy, watching their child sleep. Grace could see all of it, clear and bright as a photograph. She'd always had that gift, the ability to look at empty rooms and see the life that would fill them. It was what made her good at her job. It was also, in the quiet hours, what made her ache. She walked the Hendersons through the rest of the house, pointing out the original crown molding in the dining room, the updated electrical panel, the way the kitchen opened onto a backyard big enough for a swing set and summer barbecues. Elise touched everything. The granite countertops, the vintage doorknobs, the built-in bookshelves in the living room, as if she were memorizing the house through her fingertips. Louis followed a step behind, occasionally meeting Grace's eyes with a look of helpless, joyful surrender. By the time they reached the front porch, Elise was crying openly, and Louis had his arm around her shoulders. "We'll call you tomorrow," Elise said, pulling Grace into an impulsive hug. She smelled like honeysuckle perfume and happy tears. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "It's my pleasure," Grace said, and it was true. "You two are going to be so happy here, I can tell." She stood on the porch and watched them walk to their car, still holding hands, still leaning into each other like two trees that had grown together at the roots. Louis opened Elise's door for her. She pulled him down for a kiss before she got in. Their laughter carried across the winter-brown lawn, bright and unconscious and impossibly young. Grace lifted her hand to wave as they pulled away. She held the smile until the car disappeared around the corner. Then she went back inside, locked the door behind her, and stood alone in the empty living room. The silence had a weight to it. Not oppressive. The house was too full of good bones and southern light for that, but present, tangible. The kind of silence that reminded you there was no one waiting to break it. Grace checked her phone. No missed calls, no new texts. The screen showed the time, 4:47 p.m., and the date, December 23rd, and nothing else. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. Her calendar was blank. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and made herself walk through the house one more time, checking windows, adjusting blinds, doing all the small professional tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind quiet. In the nursery, she paused again. The light had shifted to amber now, the sun beginning its slow winter descent. A dust mote floated through the beam, lazy and aimless, catching the light like a tiny, wandering star. Grace thought about her own apartment, the single set of dishes in the cabinet, the bed that was always made because no one was there to unmake it, the Christmas tree she'd put up last weekend, a modest 5-footer, decorated with ornaments she'd collected over the years from her travels, a glass hummingbird from Savannah, a painted wooden snowflake from a craft fair in Asheville, a tiny silver picture frame that held nothing because she didn't have anyone to put in it. The tree was beautiful. She'd made sure of that. Every year she made sure of that. Made sure her apartment looked like a magazine spread, like the kind of place where a happy, fulfilled person lived. She'd learned that trick a long time ago. If you couldn't feel like you belonged in your own life, you could at least make your life look like it belonged to you. She was fine. She was fine. Plenty of people spent Christmas alone. It didn't mean anything was wrong with them. It was just circumstances, choices, the way things had worked out. Her parents had retired to Savannah 3 years ago, following the sunshine and the promise of a slower pace. They'd invited her down for Christmas, of course. They invited her every year. But there was always something strained about those visits now, something careful. Her mother watched her with worried eyes and asked gentle questions about her love life. Her father patted her shoulder and told her not to give up hope. They meant well. They always meant well. But spending the holiday reassuring them that she wasn't as lonely as she looked felt lonelier than staying home. Her college friends had scattered to the winds after graduation. Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, the inevitable drift toward husbands and children and careers that left less and less time for reunions. She still kept in touch with a few of them through social media, the occasional text chain, the birthday calls that grew further apart each year. But the holidays were for family, and her friends had families now. And Grace had herself. She locked the front door of the Henderson house, pocketed the key, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold bit at her cheeks immediately, sharp and clean, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Across the street, a neighbor was stringing lights along his roofline, perched precariously on a ladder while his wife called up helpful suggestions. 2 houses down, children were building a snowman in the front yard, shrieking with laughter every time the middle section collapsed. Sweetgum Meadows in December. Grace had lived here her whole life, 34 years, minus the 4 she'd spent at the University of Georgia, and the town still surprised her sometimes with its beauty. Main Street would be glowing by now, every storefront draped in lights and garland, the big tree in the town square glittering like something out of a Hallmark movie. Tomorrow night, there'd be the candlelight walk, the whole town processing around the square, with candles cupped in mittened hands, singing carols in slightly off-key harmony. Christmas morning, the church bells would ring and families would gather, and Rochelle's old-fashioned diner would be packed with people eating biscuits and gravy and catching up on a year's worth of gossip. Grace loved this town. She loved the way everyone knew everyone, the way history lived in every building, the way the seasons turned like pages in a familiar book. She'd built a good life here, a successful business, a cozy apartment, friends who cared about her. But sometimes, in moments like this one, standing on a stranger's porch while a family celebrated their future, she wondered if loving a place was enough. If you could really belong somewhere when you didn't have anyone to belong to. She got in her car and drove toward downtown, taking the long way so she could see the lights. Main Street in December was everything a small-town Christmas should be. White lights spiraled up every lamppost and dripped from every awning. Wreaths hung on every door, red ribbons fluttering in the breeze. The window displays were works of art. Mrs. Patterson at the antique shop had created a Victorian snow scene, complete with tiny ice skaters. The hardware store had gone whimsical with a workshop full of mechanical elves. Sweet and spicy Chinese Palace had strung red lanterns alongside silver tinsel, east meeting west, in cheerful holiday chaos. Grace parked in front of her office. Holloway Realty, the hand-painted sign read, in elegant script she'd chosen herself, and sat for a moment, watching the town go by. A young couple walked past holding coffee cups from the cafe, their breath fogging in the cold air. An older man carried an armful of wrapped packages, nearly dropping one before his wife caught it with a laugh. 3 teenage girls pressed their faces against the window of the bookstore, pointing at something inside, their excitement visible even from across the street. Everyone had somewhere to be, someone to be there with. Grace got out of the car and let herself into her office. The space was small but charming, a converted storefront with exposed brick walls and hardwood floors that creaked in exactly the right places. She decorated it herself. A vintage desk she'd found at an estate sale, overstuffed chairs for clients, a gallery wall of photos from her favorite closings. Happy families holding keys. Handwritten thank you notes she'd saved over the years. A map of Sweetgum Meadows with little pins marking every house she'd ever sold. There were a lot of pins. Grace sat down at her desk and stared at her computer screen without really seeing it. She should check her email, update her listings, do something productive. Instead, she found herself pulling open the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she rarely touched. Inside, beneath a stack of old contracts and a broken stapler she kept meaning to replace, was a small velvet box. She didn't open it. She never opened it anymore. But sometimes she just needed to know it was there. The box held a ring, a modest diamond on a simple gold band, given to her 3 years ago by a man named David, who had seemed at the time like a perfectly reasonable choice. He was a financial advisor from Peachtree who'd come to Sweetgum Meadows to help a client and stayed because he'd met Grace at a town council meeting and found her refreshingly uncomplicated. She should have known then that it wouldn't work. She wasn't uncomplicated. She was just good at hiding her complications. They dated for a year and a half, a pleasant blur of dinner dates and weekend trips, and increasingly pointed questions from her mother about wedding timelines. David was handsome and stable and kind. He opened doors for her. He remembered her coffee order. He talked about the future in concrete terms. The house they'd buy, the children they'd have, the life they'd build together in carefully planned increments. And Grace had said yes when he proposed, because she was 31 and tired of being alone, and because David was a good man who loved her, and because she'd convinced herself that comfortable and safe were close enough to happy. She'd worn the ring for 3 months. She'd started looking at wedding venues, meeting with caterers, collecting magazine clippings of dresses she didn't really want to wear. She'd smiled at engagement parties and thanked people for their congratulations, and tried very hard not to notice the way her chest felt tight whenever she thought about the future. The night she finally admitted the truth to herself, she was lying in bed next to David, listening to him breathe, staring at the ceiling of his sensible condo. I don't love him. The thought arrived with terrible clarity, like a light switching on in a dark room. Not, I'm not sure or I need more time, but the simple, brutal truth. She didn't love David. She never had. She'd wanted to love him. She'd tried to love him. But wanting and trying weren't the same as feeling. And feeling was the one thing she couldn't force. She'd given the ring back the next morning. David had been confused, then hurt, then angry, cycling through the stages of grief in the space of a single conversation. She didn't blame him. She couldn't even explain it properly. How did you tell someone that they were everything you should want, but nothing you actually needed? How did you explain that you'd spent 18 months trying to feel something that just wasn't there? She hadn't told him about Vincent. There was no reason to. Vincent was ancient history, a high school boyfriend she hadn't seen in over a decade. He had nothing to do with David or the engagement or the quietly desperate search for belonging that had led Grace to say yes to a man she didn't love. But sometimes, in her most honest moments, Grace wondered if that was true. If maybe the reason she couldn't love David, couldn't love any of the men she dated since she was 18, was because some part of her heart was still holding space for someone else. Someone who'd left. Someone who'd never come back. She closed the desk drawer without touching the ring. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rochelle, stopping by in 20. Don't argue. Grace smiled despite herself. Rochelle Stevens didn't ask permission. Rochelle informed you of her intentions and expected you to adjust accordingly. It was one of the things Grace loved about her, and one of the things that occasionally made her want to hide under her desk until the older woman got tired of knocking. She used the 20 minutes to close out her email, tidy up her desk, and brew a pot of coffee. The ritual of it was soothing. Measure the grounds, fill the carafe, wait for the familiar gurgle and hiss, the smell of fresh coffee filling the small office like a blessing. By the time Rochelle's knock came, 3 sharp raps, the signature rhythm Grace could have identified anywhere. The coffee was ready, and Grace had arranged her face into something that looked like holiday cheer. Merry almost Christmas, baby. Rochelle swept in, like a weather system, all warmth and energy and the faint scent of cinnamon that seemed to follow her everywhere. Her silver-streaked hair was swept up in its usual elegant twist, and she wore a red sweater with a sequined Christmas tree that would have looked ridiculous on anyone else but somehow looked exactly right on her. I brought snickerdoodles and gossip, not necessarily in that order. Rochelle, you didn't have to. Hush. Rochelle deposited a tin of cookies on Grace's desk and settled into one of the overstuffed client chairs like she owned it. Pour me some of that coffee and sit down. I have news. Grace poured 2 cups, black for herself, cream and 2 sugars for Rochelle, and sat. She knew better than to rush this. Rochelle had her own rhythm, and trying to hurry her along only made her dig in her heels. Benjamin sends his love, Rochelle said, accepting the coffee cup with a nod of approval. The B&B is packed this week. Christmas tourists, you know how it is. Everybody wants a charming small-town holiday experience. She made air quotes with her free hand, as if we're some kind of theme park. But the money's good, and I do love decorating, so I can't complain. The luminarias look beautiful this year, Grace offered. Thank you, baby. I did them myself. Benjamin wanted to hire someone, can you imagine? Hire someone to line up paper bags with candles. The man has no sense of tradition. But she said it fondly, the way she always talked about her husband of 2 years, exasperated and adoring in equal measure. Grace smiled and waited. Rochelle took a long sip of her coffee, watching Grace over the rim with sharp dark eyes. So, she said finally, have you heard? Heard what? About Eddie Mae Aldridge's boy. Grace's hand tightened around her coffee cup. The movement was small, barely perceptible, but Rochelle missed nothing. Vincent, Rochelle continued, still watching. He's back in town. Been here almost 2 weeks now, sorting through his mama's things, staying at the old house all by himself. She shook her head, her earrings swaying with emotion. That poor boy. Eddie Mae would have hated knowing he was alone at Christmas. Grace took a careful sip of her coffee. It burned her tongue slightly, which was good. The small pain gave her something to focus on, besides the sudden racing of her heart. I heard she passed in the spring, she said, keeping her voice neutral. I sent a card. I know you did, baby. Eddie Mae would have appreciated that. Rochelle's gaze softened. She talked about you sometimes, you know, asked after you. I always wondered if she was hoping. She trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. But Grace heard the ending anyway. Hoping you and Vincent would find your way back to each other. Grace set down her coffee cup. Rochelle, I'm not meddling. I'm just saying. You're absolutely meddling. Well, someone has to. Rochelle leaned forward, and the playfulness drained from her expression, leaving something more serious beneath. Grace Holloway, I've known you since you were 5 years old. I watched you grow up. I watched you fall in love with that boy, and I watched you let him go, and I've watched you spend the last 16 years building a beautiful life that doesn't have anyone in it to share it with. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but Rochelle held up a hand. Don't tell me you're fine. I know you're fine. Fine isn't the problem. The problem is that fine isn't the same as happy, and you deserve to be happy. She paused. So does Vincent, for that matter. Mrs. Zhang saw him at the restaurant yesterday. Said he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Barely touched his food. Barely said 2 words. Just a man sitting alone in a booth, looking like he lost something he can't find. The image hit Grace harder than she expected. Vincent, alone. Vincent, grieving. Vincent, back in the town they'd both grown up in, surrounded by memories of his mother and, maybe, memories of her. What do you want me to do about it? She asked quietly. Rochelle smiled. She reached into the large tote bag she'd brought with her and pulled out a casserole dish covered in foil. I made him my mama's chicken and rice. You know the one. Eddie May loved it. But Benjamin's got me running ragged with the B&B, and I just don't have time to run it over myself. She placed the dish on Grace's desk, right next to the cookie tin. I don't suppose you could do me a favor? Grace stared at the casserole dish. She should say no. She should absolutely say no. Vincent Aldridge was ancient history, a high school boyfriend she hadn't seen since she was 18 years old. Whatever they'd had, it was over. It had been over for 16 years. There was no reason to go stirring up old feelings, old hurts, old what-ifs that would only make her lonelier in the end. But Eddie May had been a good woman, a kind woman. She'd welcomed Grace into her home like family, taught her how to make sweet tea the proper way, held her while she cried after her grandmother's funeral. She'd hugged Grace goodbye the day Vincent left for college and whispered, "Take care of yourself, honey, and take care of that heart of yours." Grace owed her something. Maybe this was it. "Fine," she heard herself say. "I'll take it over." Rochelle's smile was triumphant. "That's my girl. The dish just needs 30 minutes at 350. The instructions are taped to the top. And Grace? Wear something pretty." Grace rolled her eyes, but Rochelle was already standing, gathering her bag, pressing a kiss to Grace's cheek that smelled like cinnamon and Chanel No. 5. "Merry Christmas, baby," she said from the doorway. "I hope you find something wonderful under your tree this year." Then she was gone, leaving Grace alone with a tin of cookies and a casserole dish and the dizzy, terrifying feeling of something about to change. She went home first. That was reasonable. She needed to change out of her work clothes, freshen up, maybe eat something, since she'd skipped lunch and her stomach was starting to protest. She absolutely did not need to spend 45 minutes standing in front of her closet, pulling out sweaters and holding them up to her reflection, trying to find the one that looked effortlessly casual instead of desperately trying. The gold one. Rochelle had mentioned the gold one. Grace put on the gold one. It was soft cashmere, a golden sweater that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. She'd bought it last year on a whim, seduced by the color and the feel of it, and she'd worn it maybe 3 times. It was the kind of sweater you saved for special occasions, for moments that mattered. This wasn't a special occasion. She was just dropping off a casserole. She left her hair down, it fell past her shoulders now, longer than she'd worn it in high school, and put on just enough makeup to look like she wasn't wearing any. A swipe of mascara, a touch of lip gloss. Nothing that said, "I spent an hour getting ready to see you." The casserole went in the oven while she got dressed, filling her apartment with the savory smell of Rochelle's cooking. When the timer went off, Grace wrapped the dish carefully in a clean towel, grabbed her coat and keys, and headed for the door. Then she stopped, went back to her bedroom, opened her jewelry box. The bracelet lay coiled in the corner, exactly where she'd left it. A delicate silver chain with a small heart charm, slightly tarnished now from years of occasional wearing and careful storage. Vincent had given it to her on Christmas Eve of their senior year. He'd saved up for 3 months to buy it, working weekends at the hardware store, and he'd been so nervous when he gave it to her that his hands shook. "I know it's not much," he'd said, "but I wanted you to have something. Something that means, what you mean to me." She'd cried. She'd kissed him until they were both breathless. She'd worn the bracelet every day for the rest of the school year, right up until the day he left. She hadn't worn it since. Grace touched the chain with one fingertip, feeling the cool slide of silver, the familiar weight of memory. Then she closed the jewelry box and walked out the door. The Aldridge house sat at the end of Maple Street, a 2-story craftsman with a wide front porch and a yard that Eddie May had always kept immaculate. The azaleas were dormant now, bare brown branches waiting for spring, but someone had strung white lights along the porch railing. They glowed in the blue winter dusk, small and brave against the gathering dark. Grace parked at the curb and sat in her car, engine idling, casserole warm in her lap. She could still leave. She could drive away, take the casserole home, eat it herself over the next 3 days. Rochelle would be disappointed, but Rochelle would get over it, and Grace would be spared. What? A difficult conversation? An awkward reunion? The risk of feeling something she'd spent 16 years trying to unfeel? Coward, she thought. She turned off the engine and got out of the car. The walk to the front porch felt longer than it should have. The wooden steps creaked under her feet. They'd always creaked. She remembered that now. Remembered the way she used to skip the third one because it was loudest, trying not to wake Eddie May when Vincent walked her to the door after late dates. She was 34 years old, a successful businesswoman, a pillar of her community. There was no reason for her heart to be pounding like she was 17 again, standing on this same porch, waiting for the boy she loved to answer the door. She rang the bell. Footsteps inside. A pause, the click of a lock, and then the door swung open. And there he was. Vincent Aldridge at 34 was different from Vincent Aldridge at 18 in all the ways that time changes everyone. Broader through the shoulders, his jaw more defined, faint lines etched at the corners of his eyes. His dark hair was mussed, like he'd been running his hands through it, and there was silver threaded through the temples now, just enough to notice, just enough to make Grace's breath catch. He wore a rumpled flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days, and he had the look of someone who'd been awake too long and alone too much. But his eyes were the same, deep brown, warm and startled and achingly familiar. Eyes that had looked at her across 100 classrooms, 1,000 moments, a lifetime ago. "Grace?" he said, her name in his mouth, low and wondering, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. "Say something," she told herself. "Say anything. Be normal. Be professional. I brought you dinner," she said, and held out the casserole like an offering. "Rochelle made it, her mama's chicken and rice," she said. "Eddie May used to love it." Vincent stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the casserole, then back up at her, and slowly, impossibly, he smiled. "Hi, Gracie," he said. Nobody had called her that in 16 years. She felt it everywhere.
Chapter 2. The boxes weren't going to pack themselves. Vincent had been telling himself that for 3 days now, standing in the doorway of his mother's bedroom with a roll of packing tape in one hand and a sense of dread lodged somewhere behind his sternum. The room looked exactly the way Eddie May had left it, bed neatly made with the pale blue quilt she'd had since before he was born, reading glasses folded on the nightstand next to a worn paperback, slippers tucked under the bed as if she might swing her feet down any moment and step into them. She wouldn't, of course. She'd been gone since April. A stroke, sudden and merciless, the kind of death people called a blessing because she hadn't suffered, as if the swiftness of losing someone could make up for the permanence of it, as if blessing was a word that could share a sentence with your mother is dead. Vincent set down the packing tape and walked away from the bedroom door. He'd been doing that a lot this week, walking away, finding excuses, telling himself he'd tackle the hard stuff tomorrow, then letting tomorrow slide into the next day and the next, until somehow 2 weeks had passed and the house was still full of his mother's life and he was still sleeping in the guest room because he couldn't bring himself to wash her sheets. The kitchen was easier. He'd made progress there, emptied the pantry of expired cans, boxed up the dishes he didn't want to keep, wiped down shelves that hadn't been wiped in years. Practical tasks, mindless tasks, the kind of work that let him feel productive without requiring him to feel anything else. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd made that morning and stood at the window, looking out at the backyard. The bird feeder was empty. His mother had filled it every Sunday, a ritual she'd maintained for as long as Vincent could remember. Cardinals and blue jays and the occasional brazen squirrel, all of them gathering in the old magnolia tree, waiting for Eddie May to bring them their breakfast. He should fill the feeder. It seemed like the kind of thing a good son would do. He didn't move. The truth was, Vincent didn't know how to be here. Didn't know how to exist in this house that was so full of his mother's presence and so empty of her actual self. Every room held ambushes. A grocery list in her handwriting stuck to the fridge, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, the faint scent of lavender hand lotion that still clung to the bathroom towels. He kept catching himself listening for her footsteps, her humming, the particular way she said his name when she wanted his attention. "Vincent Michael, come help me with this. Vincent Michael, did you eat breakfast? Vincent Michael, I love you to the moon and back. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed his eyes. Seattle had been easier. In Seattle, he could almost pretend his mother was still here, still puttering around her kitchen, still calling him every Sunday evening to catch up on his week, still alive in all the ways that mattered, even if he couldn't see her. Distance made denial possible. You could convince yourself that nothing had really changed when you were 2,000 miles away from the proof. But now he was home. Now he was standing in her kitchen, drinking coffee from her mugs, sleeping in her house. And she was gone, and he was alone, and somehow he had to figure out what to do with 34 years of accumulated living. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from his boss. Hope you're doing okay. Let me know if you need anything. Vincent typed back a quick time. Thanks, all good, then set the phone face down so he wouldn't have to look at the screen anymore. He wasn't all good. He was the opposite of all good. But saying that would require explaining, and explaining would require feeling, and feeling was the one thing he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd gotten the call. Mr. Aldridge? I'm calling from Sweetgum Meadows General Hospital. I'm afraid I have some difficult news. He'd been at his desk when the call came. Middle of a Tuesday afternoon, sun streaming through his office window, halfway through debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code. His phone had rung with an unfamiliar Georgia number, and he'd almost let it go to voicemail. He got spam calls all the time, robotic voices promising to extend his car warranty or reduce his credit card debt. But something had made him answer. Some instinct, some premonition, some part of him that already knew. His mother was gone. A stroke, quick, painless. The doctors had done everything they could. Vincent remembered saying thank you to the woman on the phone, as if she'd given him a gift instead of shattering his world. He remembered hanging up carefully, setting his phone on his desk, staring at his computer screen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The code blurred in front of him. The cursor blinked. Somewhere in the building, someone laughed. He'd gotten on a plane that night, handled the arrangements in a fog of paperwork and phone calls and decisions that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Picked out a casket, chose the flowers, stood in the front pew of the church where his mother had sung in the choir for 40 years and listened to people tell him what a wonderful woman she'd been. He knew that. He'd always known that. What he hadn't known, what he was only now beginning to understand, was how much of his own life had been built around the assumption of her presence. How many of his choices had been made with the unconscious certainty that she would be there to witness them, to celebrate them, to offer her steady, unconditional love no matter what. Now that certainty was gone, and Vincent felt like a building whose foundation had been quietly removed. Still standing for the moment, but unsure how long that could last. He finished his coffee and rinsed the mug in the sink. Then he made himself walk back to the bedroom doorway and pick up the packing tape. 1 box, he told himself. Just pack 1 box, and then you can stop for the day. He started with the closet. Eddie Mae Aldridge had not been a woman who believed in throwing things away. Vincent discovered this gradually, as he worked his way through the closet shelf by shelf. There were shoeboxes full of greeting cards from every holiday going back decades, Christmases and birthdays and Mother's Days, some from Vincent, some from relatives he barely remembered, a few from names he didn't recognize at all. There were stacks of old magazines, their covers faded and curling, saved for recipes his mother had probably never gotten around to making. There were bags of fabric scraps from sewing projects, tangles of yarn from knitting phases, a collection of empty glass jars that she'd surely intended to reuse for something. And there were photographs, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, loose in boxes, stuffed in envelopes, crammed into albums that had long since run out of pages. Vincent's entire childhood was here, preserved in fading Kodak prints and the occasional Polaroid, baby pictures and school portraits, birthday parties and family vacations, a gap-toothed 7-year-old beaming beside a just-caught fish, a sullen teenager in an ill-fitting suit at some relative's wedding. He sat on the floor of the closet, surrounded by his own history, and let the photographs wash over him. There was his father, young and handsome in a way Vincent only vaguely remembered. Gerald Aldridge had died when Vincent was 11, a car accident, icy roads, a truck that crossed the center line. Vincent's memories of him were fragmentary now. The smell of his aftershave, the rumble of his laugh, the way his big hands had felt wrapped around Vincent's smaller ones as he taught him to grip a baseball bat. The grief had faded to a dull ache over the years, something he carried without really noticing most of the time. But seeing his father's face in these photographs brought it rushing back, not sharp anymore, but deep, a sorrow that had settled into his bones and become part of who he was. His mother had raised him alone after that, worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, made sure he had everything he needed, even when it meant she went without, sat with him at the kitchen table every night to help with homework, even when she was exhausted. She'd been his whole world for so long. Mother and father, cheerleader and disciplinarian, the fixed point around which everything else revolved. And now she was gone, too, and Vincent was alone in a way he'd never been before. He set aside the photo of his father and kept digging. The next box was different, smaller, tucked into the back corner of the shelf, half hidden behind a stack of old blankets. Vincent pulled it out and felt something shift inside. Papers, maybe, or more photographs. He lifted the lid. His breath caught. The box was full of him. But not just him and her. Grace. There were photographs here too, but these were different from the family shots scattered everywhere else. These were the pictures of a high school romance, the kind you took with disposable cameras and printed at the drugstore. Vincent and Grace at a football game, bundled in jackets and sharing a cup of hot chocolate. Vincent and Grace at prom, her in a red dress that complemented her dark brown skin, him in a rented tux that didn't quite fit. Vincent and Grace on the porch of this very house, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into the summer sun. He remembered that day. His mother had taken the picture, teasing them about how cute they were until they were both blushing. Grace had laughed and hidden her face against his shoulder, and he'd felt like the luckiest person in the world. Beneath the photographs were other things. A movie ticket stub from their first real date, some romantic comedy he couldn't remember anymore, though he remembered every second of sitting next to her in the dark, their hands brushing in the shared popcorn. A pressed flower from the corsage he'd given her at prom, still holding a ghost of its original pink. A folded piece of notebook paper with Grace's handwriting on it, "I love you," with a smiley face, passed to him in study hall during their junior year. And at the bottom of the box, in his own handwriting, a letter. Vincent unfolded it carefully, the paper soft and creased from age. He'd forgotten about this letter, or maybe he'd made himself forget. "Dear Grace, I've been trying to figure out how to say this for weeks, and I keep chickening out every time I see you. So I'm writing it down instead, because maybe that way I can actually get the words out. I know we said we were going to do the mature thing. I know we agreed that long distance would be too hard and we're too young to make promises we might not be able to keep. I know all of that. I know it's the smart decision. But I don't want to be smart. I want to be with you. I love you, Gracie. I've loved you since the first time you laughed at one of my dumb jokes in Mrs. Patterson's English class. I'll probably love you for the rest of my life. And I know that's a lot to say when we're only 18, but it's true. And I can't leave without telling you. Ask me to stay, please, or come with me, or just tell me that you want this as much as I do, and we'll figure the rest out together. I don't care about being practical. I don't care about being mature. I just care about you. I'm going to give you this letter tomorrow, or maybe the day after, or maybe I'll chicken out again and never give it to you at all. But at least I wrote it down. At least now it's real. I love you. Vincent." He'd never given her the letter. He'd carried it in his pocket for a week, waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had never come. And then it was the morning of his flight, and Grace was standing in his driveway with tears on her cheeks, and all he could do was hold her and promise to call and pretend that his heart wasn't shattering into 1,000 pieces. He'd told himself it was for the best. She'd never asked him to stay. She'd never suggested coming with him. She'd agreed, too quickly he'd thought at the time, that a clean break was the mature thing to do. He'd taken her silence as an answer. I don't love you enough to fight for this. So he'd left. and he'd never come back. 16 years, 2 college degrees, 3 jobs, half a dozen apartments, a string of relationships that never quite worked, that always felt like he was trying to fit a key into the wrong lock. A successful career, a comfortable life, a carefully constructed existence that looked impressive from the outside and felt hollow from within. And the whole time, somewhere in the back of a closet in Sweetgum Meadows, Georgia, his mother had kept this box, these photographs, this letter he'd never sent. Vincent sat on the closet floor with the letter in his hands and felt 16 years of certainty begin to crack. He needed to get out of the house. The realization came suddenly, urgently, like the walls were closing in. He shoved the letter back into the box, put the box back on the shelf, and grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. It was nearly dark outside, the winter sun already slipping below the horizon, but he didn't care. He couldn't stay in this house another minute, surrounded by ghosts and memories and questions he didn't know how to answer. Main Street was alive with Christmas lights when he got there. Vincent parked near the town square and walked without any particular destination, letting the cold air clear his head. The town looked different and exactly the same. Some new businesses he didn't recognize, some old landmarks he remembered from childhood, the same overall feeling of a place that existed slightly outside of time. Sweet and spicy Chinese Palace still occupied its corner spot near the hardware store. The red lanterns in the window glowed warmly, and the smell of ginger and garlic drifted out every time someone opened the door. Vincent's stomach growled. He'd forgotten to eat lunch again. The restaurant was busy but not packed. Families gathered around tables covered in platters of kung pao chicken and lo mein. Vincent slid into an empty booth near the back and studied the menu, even though he already knew what he'd order. Some things didn't change. The kung pao had been his favorite since he was 10 years old. Vincent Aldridge? He looked up to find Mrs. Zhang standing beside his table, her face creased with the same warm smile he remembered from childhood. She was older now, weren't they all, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, taking in everything about him in a single sweeping glance. "Mrs. Zhang," he said, standing to accept the hug she was already moving in for. "It's good to see you. Sit." She waved him back down and slid into the opposite side of the booth without asking. "Let me look at you. So handsome. Your mother always said you were handsome, and she was right." Her smile faltered slightly. "I was so sorry to hear about Eddie May. She was a good woman, a good friend." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "She always spoke highly of you, too. We sang together in the choir for 30 years, sat next to each other every Sunday. She had a beautiful alto voice, your mother." Mrs. Zhang shook her head, her eyes going distant for a moment. "The choir isn't the same without her." They talked for a few minutes, about his mother, about the house, about how long he was planning to stay. Vincent answered as honestly as he could, which wasn't very honestly at all. He didn't know how long he was staying. He didn't know what he was going to do with the house. He didn't know much of anything, really, except that the kung pao chicken still smelled amazing, and he desperately wanted this conversation to end before it veered into territory he wasn't prepared to navigate. It veered anyway. "You know who else has been alone too much lately?" Mrs. Zhang said, her tone shifting into something a little too casual. "Grace Holloway. You remember Grace, don't you? Sweet girl. She's a realtor now, very successful. Helped my niece find a beautiful house last year." Vincent's hand tightened around his water glass. "I remember Grace. Such a shame, a girl like that still single. Pretty, smart, kind. You'd think the men in this town would be lining up." Mrs. Zhang sighed dramatically. "But she works so hard, always helping everyone else find their dream home. Never has time to find her own, if you know what I mean." He knew exactly what she meant. He also knew that Mrs. Zhang was about as subtle as a freight train, and that anything he said right now would be reported back to at least 3 other people before he finished his meal. "It's been a long time," he said carefully. "I'm sure Grace has her own life now." Mrs. Zhang made a non-committal sound that managed to convey profound skepticism. "Well, you should stop by and say hello while you're in town. She'd like that, I think, for old time's sake." She patted his hand and stood up, leaving him with a menu he no longer had any appetite for and a head full of thoughts he'd spent 16 years trying to avoid. Grace Holloway, still here, still single, still the girl he'd never quite gotten over. Vincent ate his Kung Pao chicken without tasting it, paid his bill, and drove back to the house on Maple Street. The white lights on the porch railing greeted him like old friends. His mother had put them up in early December, the same way she did every year. She must have known even then that something was wrong. She'd mentioned feeling tired on the phone, had canceled their usual Sunday call once because she wasn't up to talking. But she'd still climbed the ladder to string the lights, still made the house beautiful for a Christmas she wouldn't live to see. Vincent sat in his car in the driveway, engine off, and let the grief wash over him. He missed her. God, he missed her. Missed her voice and her laugh and the way she always knew exactly what he needed to hear. Missed the person who'd known him longest, loved him most, believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. She'd been his anchor for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to drift. But underneath the grief, there was something else now. Something Mrs. Zhang's words had stirred up. Something the box in the closet had cracked open. Grace. He'd spent 16 years convincing himself that he'd made the right choice, that leaving was the mature thing to do, that Grace's silence on that last morning, her lack of protest, her calm acceptance, meant she didn't love him enough to fight for them. But what if he'd been wrong? What if she'd been waiting for him to fight? What if her silence wasn't acceptance but fear, the same fear that had kept him from giving her the letter? What if they'd both been 18 and stupid and so terrified of being hurt that they'd hurt each other instead? He couldn't know. It had been too long. Too much had happened. Grace had built a life here, and he'd built a life somewhere else, and whatever they'd had was ancient history now. But he was here, and she was here, and for the first time in 16 years, they were in the same place at the same time. You should stop by and say hello while you're in town. Vincent got out of the car and went inside. The house was quiet, the way it always was now. He hung up his jacket, turned on the living room lamp, stood in the middle of the room and looked around at his mother's things. The photographs on the mantel, the throw blanket draped over the back of the couch, the small artificial Christmas tree she'd put up on the side table, still lit, still cheerful, still waiting for a celebration that would never come. He should take the tree down. He should pack it away with everything else. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. It felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. Instead, he walked over to the hallway and stopped in front of the photograph hanging there. Prom. Senior year. Grace in that red dress, her hair swept up, her smile bright enough to light up the whole frame. Vincent beside her in his two big tucks, looking at her like she was the only person in the room. Because she had been, really. From the moment he'd met her, 14 years old, awkward and shy, completely undone by the pretty girl with the warm laugh who'd been assigned to help him pass English, Grace Holloway had been the center of his universe. He'd just been too scared to tell her. The doorbell rang. Vincent frowned. It was after 6, late for visitors in a town that still believed in keeping reasonable hours, probably a neighbor checking in, wanting to offer condolences or casseroles or both. He'd had a lot of those visits in the first week, a parade of well-meaning faces he barely remembered, all of them wanting to tell him what a wonderful woman his mother had been. He opened the door, and there she was. Grace Holloway stood on his mother's porch, exactly where she'd stood 100 times when they were young. She was holding a casserole dish, and there were snowflakes in her hair, and she was wearing a gold sweater that made her eyes look like warmth and home. She was beautiful. She'd always been beautiful. But she was different now, too. More settled in herself, more sure. The girl he'd known had become a woman he didn't recognize, and somehow that made her more beautiful still. "Grace," he said, and his voice came out hoarse, cracked, like he'd forgotten how to use it. She looked at him with those brown eyes, and he watched her take him in, the same way he was taking her in, cataloging the changes, searching for the familiar underneath. Her lips parted slightly, her cheeks flushed pink, and he didn't think it was just from the cold. "I brought you dinner," she said. "Rochelle made it, her mama's chicken and rice." She said, Eddie May used to love it. Rochelle. Of course, the town matchmakers were already at work. But Vincent didn't care about Rochelle or her machinations or anything else. He cared about the woman standing in front of him, the girl he'd loved and lost and never stopped thinking about, the letter still sitting unsent in a box in his mother's closet. "Hi, Gracie," he said. He watched the name land, watched her react to it. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or memory, or the same overwhelming rush of "you're here, you're really here" that was flooding through his own chest. "Hi, Vincent," she said softly. They stood there for a moment, the cold air swirling between them, 16 years of silence stretching like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Then Vincent stepped back and held the door open wider. "Do you want to come in?" She came in. Vincent took the casserole dish from her hands, their fingers brushing in the transfer, a spark of contact that shot straight through him, and carried it to the kitchen. Grace followed, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floors, her presence filling up the empty spaces in a way he hadn't realized he'd been craving. "The house looks the same," she said, her voice careful. "I mean, not exactly the same, but the feeling of it, it still feels like Eddie May." "Yeah." Vincent set the casserole on the counter and turned to face her. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms wrapped around herself, taking in the room with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I haven't changed much. Haven't had the heart to, really." "I understand." Grace's eyes met his. "When my grandmother passed, I couldn't touch her sewing room for almost a year. Just knowing all her things were still there, exactly where she'd left them, it felt like she might come back any minute. Like if I moved anything, I'd be admitting she was really gone." Vincent nodded slowly. "That's exactly it." "Does it help?" she asked. "Keeping everything the same?" No. The word came out before he could stop it, more honest than he'd intended. "It doesn't help at all, but I can't seem to stop doing it." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed the kitchen and did something he didn't expect. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, friendly, comforting, the kind of thing anyone might do for someone who was grieving. But her hand was warm through the fabric of his shirt, and she was close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and floral, different from the vanilla body spray she'd worn in high school, and every nerve in his body was suddenly, painfully awake. "I'm sorry about your mom," Grace said. "I know that's what everyone says, but I mean it. Eddie May she was special. She was always so kind to me. She loved you." The word slipped out, another unguarded truth. "She used to ask about you, you know. Every time we talked, 'Have you heard from Grace? Do you know how she's doing?' I think she kept hoping." He stopped. He'd been about to say too much, but Grace's hand tightened on his arm just slightly. "Hoping what?" Vincent looked at her, really looked, for the first time since she'd appeared on his doorstep. The years had changed her, filled out the angular lines of her teenage face, added a depth to her eyes that spoke of experiences he hadn't shared. But underneath all of that, she was still Grace, still the girl who'd made him feel seen when he'd spent most of his life feeling invisible. "I don't know," he said, which was a lie. "Maybe she just missed you." Grace's expression flickered, something passing across her face too quickly to identify, and then she stepped back, breaking the contact. "I should let you eat," she said. "The casserole just needs to be heated up. 30 minutes at 350. Rochelle's instructions are on the foil." "Stay." The word surprised them both. Grace's eyes widened slightly, and Vincent felt his face heat. "I mean, if you want to. I've been eating alone for 2 weeks, and I'm pretty tired of my own company." He tried for a smile that probably looked more desperate than casual. "There's enough food for both of us, and I make decent coffee if you're interested." Grace hesitated. He could see her weighing it, the awkwardness of staying versus the awkwardness of leaving, the weight of their history pressing down on the simple question of whether to share a meal. "Okay," she said finally. "Coffee sounds good." They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where Vincent had done homework and eaten Sunday dinners and played cards with his mother on rainy afternoons. Rochelle's chicken and rice was as good as he remembered, rich and comforting, the kind of food that felt like a hug from the inside. The conversation started carefully, both of them testing the waters. Vincent asked about her work. Grace explained the ins and outs of small-town real estate with an animation that made it clear she genuinely loved what she did. She asked about Seattle. He described his job in terms vague enough to be accurate and boring enough to deflect further questions. But slowly, as the food disappeared and the coffee cups were refilled, the careful walls began to lower. "Do you remember Mrs. Patterson's English class?" Grace asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "How you used to argue with her about every single assignment," Vincent groaned. "I wasn't arguing, I was discussing. You told her that Hamlet was an overrated procrastinator who needed to get over himself. He was. He spent the entire play moping around and giving speeches instead of actually doing anything. If he'd just stabbed his uncle in Act 1, everyone would have lived." Grace laughed, really laughed, the way she used to, her whole face lighting up with it. "You're still wrong, but I admire your commitment." "I'm not wrong. I'm just ahead of my time." He grinned at her, and for a moment it was easy. For a moment, they were just two people who'd known each other forever, falling back into old rhythms like no time had passed at all. Then Grace's laughter faded, and she looked down at her coffee cup, and the weight of 16 years settled back over them like a blanket. "I didn't think you'd ever come back," she said quietly. "To Sweetgum, I mean. After you left, I don't know. I guess I assumed you'd moved on, found a life somewhere else, forgotten about this place." "I never forgot." Vincent's voice was rough. "I thought about this town every day, every single day, Grace. He stopped. The words were piling up in his throat, all the things he'd never said, never written, never admitted even to himself. The letter in the box. The years of silence. The question that had haunted him since the morning he'd driven away and watched her disappear in his rearview mirror. "You just what?" Grace asked. "Why didn't you ask me to stay?" He couldn't say it. Not yet. Not when they were just finding their way back to something like friendship. Not when the wound was still so fresh he wasn't sure he could survive reopening it. "I just didn't know how to come back," he said instead. "Every year I'd think about visiting, and every year I'd find a reason not to. Work was busy, flights were expensive, I'd come home for Christmas next year, or the year after that, or—" He shook his head. "And then there were no more years. She was gone, and I'd waited too long, and now I'm here surrounded by her things, and I don't know what to do with any of it." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. It was the second time she'd touched him tonight, and it affected him just as strongly as the first. Her fingers were warm and certain, wrapping around his with a familiarity that made his chest ache. "You'll figure it out," she said. "You don't have to figure it out tonight, or tomorrow, or next week. You just have to keep showing up. Keep going through the boxes. Keep letting yourself feel whatever you need to feel." She squeezed his hand gently. "Grief doesn't have a timeline, Vincent. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying." He looked at her hand wrapped around his. At the delicate curve of her wrist, the bare ring finger, he'd noticed that earlier, filed it away without letting himself examine what it meant, the faint traces of age that somehow made her more beautiful than she'd been at 18. "Thank you," he said, "for coming over, for staying. I didn't realize how much I needed." He paused, searching for the right word. "Company. I didn't realize how much I needed company." Grace smiled at him, soft and sad, and something else he couldn't name. "That's what the lonely do at Christmas," she said. "They find each other." She left around 9 with promises to come back the next day. Something about walking through the house, giving him a professional assessment if he decided to sell. They both knew it was an excuse, a reason to see each other again that didn't require them to admit what was really happening. Vincent didn't care. He'd take any excuse she offered. He stood on the porch and watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing around the corner, the street settling back into its quiet winter darkness. The cold bit at his cheeks, but he didn't go inside. Not yet. Grace Holloway. She was here. She was real. She was still the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and she'd held his hand across his mother's kitchen table and looked at him like he wasn't as lost as he felt. He thought about the letter in the closet. The unsent declaration of a love he'd carried for 16 years without ever putting down. All this time he'd told himself it was over, that she'd let him go without a fight because she didn't love him enough to hold on. All this time he'd buried his feelings so deep, he'd almost convinced himself they weren't there. But she'd come to his door with a casserole and snowflakes in her hair, and it had taken him approximately 3 seconds to realize that nothing was over. Nothing had ever been over. He'd just been too afraid to admit it. Tomorrow she was coming back. Tomorrow he'd see her again. Vincent stood on the porch until the cold finally drove him inside, then went to bed with her name echoing in his head like a prayer.
Chapter 3. Grace drove home through streets glittering with Christmas lights and tried to remember how to breathe. Her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. She gripped it tighter, willing herself to focus on the road, the familiar turns, the stop signs she'd been navigating since she was 16 years old. Left on Maple, right on Oak. Straight through the square, past the big tree with its decades of mismatched ornaments, past the diner where Malachi and Amy were probably closing up for the night, past all the landmarks of a life she'd built in this town while trying not to think about the boy who'd left it, the boy who was back, the boy who'd looked at her tonight like no time had passed at all, like she was still 18, still his, still the center of everything. "Hi, Gracie." She pulled into the small parking lot behind her building and sat in the car with the engine off, letting the cold seep in around her. Her breath fogged the windshield. Her heart was still pounding, a heavy drumbeat that hadn't slowed since the moment Vincent opened that door. She'd known it would be hard to see him. She'd prepared herself for that, or thought she had. She'd expected awkwardness, stilted conversation, the uncomfortable weight of too much history compressed into polite, small talk. She'd expected to feel sad, maybe. Nostalgic. A little wistful for the people they used to be. She hadn't expected to feel like she was falling. The thing was, Vincent Aldridge at 34 was not the same as Vincent Aldridge at 18. The boy she'd loved had been sweet and shy, gangly in the way of teenage boys who hadn't quite grown into their bodies, more comfortable with computers than conversation. He'd blushed when she held his hand. He'd stammered when he told her she was beautiful. He'd kissed her like he was afraid she might break, gentle and reverent and achingly tender. The man she'd seen tonight was something else entirely. He was broader now, solid in a way that made her want to press herself against him and see if he felt as steady as he looked. His jaw had sharpened, his shoulders had filled out, and there was silver in his hair that should have made him look older, but somehow just made him look more real, more present, more devastatingly handsome than she'd been prepared for. Even exhausted and grief-worn, even rumpled and unshaven, he'd taken her breath away. But it wasn't just the physical changes. It was the way he carried himself now, the quiet confidence underneath the sadness, the way he'd looked at her across his mother's kitchen table with those deep brown eyes and made her feel, for the first time in years, like someone was actually seeing her. "Stay," he'd said, just like that. No hedging, no pretense. Stay. And she had. She'd stayed for 2 hours, eating Rochelle's chicken and rice and talking about nothing and everything, laughing at old memories and carefully skirting around the ones that hurt too much to touch. She'd held his hand when he talked about his mother. She'd watched his face soften when he smiled, watched the grief give way to something warmer, watched him become, just for moments, just in flashes, the boy she'd never stopped loving. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? The truth she'd been running from for 16 years. She'd never stopped loving Vincent Aldridge. She'd just gotten very, very good at pretending she had. Grace pressed her forehead against the cold steering wheel and let out a long, shaky breath. This was a disaster. This was an absolute disaster. She was supposed to drop off a casserole and leave. She was supposed to be polite and distant, offer her condolences and move on with her life. She was not supposed to sit in his kitchen for 2 hours, feeling like a teenager again, watching him smile and wanting to kiss him so badly her whole body ached with it. She was definitely not supposed to promise to come back tomorrow, but she had. She'd offered to walk through the house with him, give him a professional assessment, help him figure out what to do with the property. A reasonable offer, a neighborly gesture. The kind of thing any realtor might do for an old friend who'd recently lost his mother. Except Vincent wasn't just an old friend. He was the love of her life. And walking through that house with him tomorrow, through all the rooms where they'd kissed and laughed and fallen in love, was either going to heal something that had been broken for 16 years or shatter her completely. Grace didn't know which possibility scared her more. She didn't sleep. She tried. She put on her softest pajamas and made herself a cup of chamomile tea and climbed into her neatly made bed with every intention of closing her eyes and letting exhaustion pull her under. But her mind wouldn't quiet. Every time she started to drift, she'd see Vincent's face, the way he'd looked when he opened the door, the way his voice had cracked when he said her name, the warmth of his hand when she'd reached across the table to comfort him. At midnight, she gave up and went to sit by the window. Her apartment looked out over the town square, and the Christmas tree was still lit, its lights twinkling against the darkness. A few flurries drifted down from the sky, not enough to stick, but enough to make the air feel magical, expectant. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. The day after was Christmas. And somewhere across town, in a house full of his mother's memories, Vincent Aldridge was probably lying awake too. She wondered what he was thinking about. She wondered if he was thinking about her. Grace pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small the way she used to when she was a child, and the world felt too big to navigate. The gesture was comforting in its familiarity, a reminder that she'd survived hard things before. She'd survived losing Vincent the first time. She'd survived the years of loneliness that followed. The failed relationships, the broken engagement. She'd built a life she was proud of, a career she loved, a reputation as someone who could be counted on. She'd be fine. Whatever happened with Vincent, she'd be fine. But fine had never been the problem. Fine was easy. Fine was what you said when you didn't want to admit that something was missing, when you'd learned to live with the shape of an absence so completely that you'd almost forgotten it was there. Vincent's return had reminded her. Sitting across from him in that kitchen, holding his hand, laughing at his terrible jokes about Hamlet, she'd felt something she hadn't felt in years. Something that wasn't fine at all. Something that was messy and terrifying and wonderful. She'd felt alive. The sun came up pale and watery, filtering through clouds that promised more snow. Grace watched it from her window seat, where she'd fallen asleep sometime around 4. Her neck stiff and her back aching from the awkward position. She stretched, winced, and went to make coffee. The apartment felt different this morning. Smaller somehow, or maybe just more obviously empty. She'd lived here for 6 years and loved it. The exposed brick, the wide windows, the way the morning light made everything glow. But today she noticed the silence more than usual. The single coffee mug in the dish rack, the one toothbrush in the bathroom holder, the bed that never looked slept in because she always made it the moment she woke up, smoothing away any evidence that someone actually lived here. That's what the lonely do at Christmas. They find each other. She'd said that to Vincent last night, meaning it as comfort, and he'd looked at her with those dark eyes, and she'd felt the words settle into her own chest like a prophecy. Was that what they were doing? Finding each other? Or were they just two lonely people, thrown together by circumstance and grief and a meddling town matchmaker with a casserole dish? Grace didn't know. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Knowing meant deciding, and deciding meant risking, and risking meant potentially losing him all over again. But she'd promised to come back. And Grace Holloway kept her promises. She showered, dried her hair, and stood in front of her closet for far too long, trying to pick an outfit that said professional realtor and not woman who spent all night thinking about kissing her high school boyfriend. She settled on dark jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and boots that were practical enough for walking through an old house, but nice enough to look like she'd made an effort. She did not wear the gold sweater again. That would be too obvious. At the last minute, she opened her jewelry box and looked at the bracelet. It lay where it always lay, coiled in the corner like a sleeping snake. The silver was tarnished now. She should have it cleaned, should take better care of it, but the heart charm still caught the light, still looked exactly the way it had the night Vincent pressed it into her palm with shaking hands. I know it's not much, but I wanted you to have something. Something that means, you know, what you mean to me. Grace touched the chain with one fingertip. She remembered how it had felt to wear it every day, the slight weight of it against her wrist, the way she'd twist the charm when she was nervous or thinking or missing him. She remembered taking it off the night after he left, crying so hard she could barely see, putting it away in a drawer because she couldn't bear to look at it anymore. She'd taken it out again a few months later, and then again, and again, over the years, in moments when the loneliness got too heavy and she needed to remember that someone had loved her once, really loved her. Not the polite, reasonable affection of David and the other men she dated, but the fierce, all-consuming devotion of first love. Vincent had loved her like that. She'd never doubted it, not even when she'd let him go. The question was whether she'd loved him the same way. She had. She knew she had. But she'd been so young and so scared and so convinced that holding on would only hurt them both. She'd told herself that real love meant wanting what was best for the other person, even if it broke your heart. She'd told herself that letting him go was the bravest thing she'd ever done. Now, 16 years later, she wondered if it had actually been the most cowardly. Grace closed the jewelry box without taking out the bracelet. She wasn't ready. Not yet. The Aldridge house looked different in daylight. Grace parked at the curb and sat for a moment, taking it in. The white lights on the porch were off now, and the house had a slightly tired look in the gray winter morning. Paint peeling in a few spots, gutters that needed cleaning, a front step that was starting to sag. Eddie May had kept the place immaculate when she was well, but the last year of her life had clearly taken its toll. Still, the bones were good. Grace could see that even from the street. Solid construction, classic craftsman details, a lot with mature trees, and good setbacks from the neighbors. If Vincent decided to sell, it would go fast. Sweetgum Meadows didn't have a lot of inventory, and houses like this, houses with history, with character, were always in demand. But as Grace walked up the path to the front door, she found herself hoping he wouldn't sell. She didn't examine that hope too closely. Vincent opened the door before she could knock, and she wondered if he'd been watching for her the way she'd been watching the clock all morning. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He looked better today. Still tired, still sad around the edges, but he'd showered and shaved and put on a dark green sweater that made his eyes look warmer. His hair was damp and slightly disheveled, like he'd toweled it dry and then forgotten about it. Grace wanted to reach up and smooth it into place. She kept her hands at her sides. "I brought coffee," she said, holding up the 2 cups she'd picked up from the cafe on the square. "I didn't know how you take it anymore, so I got 1 black and 1 with cream and sugar. Dealer's choice." Vincent smiled, a real smile, the first one she'd seen that reached all the way to his eyes. "Black is fine. Some things don't change." "I remember." The words slipped out before she could stop them, weighted with more meaning than she'd intended. Vincent's smile flickered, shifted into something softer, and for a moment they just stood there in the doorway, looking at each other. Then he stepped back. "Come in. I'll give you the grand tour." Walking through the Aldridge house with Vincent was like walking through her own memories. Grace had spent countless hours here as a teenager. Sunday dinners at the kitchen table, Eddie May piling her plate high with pot roast and mashed potatoes and insisting she was too skinny, child, let me feed you. Movie nights in the living room. Curled up on the couch with Vincent, while his mother pretended to be engrossed in her crossword puzzle in the armchair. Long summer afternoons on the back porch, drinking sweet tea and talking about everything and nothing, their bare feet tangled together on the porch swing. The house had been a second home to her. Eddie May had been a second mother. And walking through these rooms now, seeing them frozen in time, filled with the belongings of a woman who would never return, it hit Grace harder than she'd expected. "The kitchen's mostly functional," Vincent was saying, his voice taking on the slightly detached tone of someone trying to be professional about something deeply personal. "Appliances are older but working. Some of the cabinet hardware is loose. I could fix that pretty easily. The countertops are original, which means they're dated, but some people like that vintage look. Grace nodded, making mental notes, even as her eyes drifted to the familiar details. The sunny yellow walls Eddie May had painted herself. The ceramic rooster cookie jar that had sat on the counter for as long as Grace could remember. The window over the sink where Eddie May used to watch the birds at the feeder while she washed dishes. "What about the rest of the house?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Have you had a chance to look at the major systems? Roof, HVAC, plumbing?" "The HVAC was replaced about 5 years ago. I found the paperwork in Mama's files. The roof is older, probably original, but it doesn't leak as far as I can tell." "Plumbing?" he shrugged. "Seems fine. I'm not exactly an expert. We can get inspections if you decide to move forward with selling, standard practice. It's actually good that you have the HVAC documentation. Buyers like to see that." She was falling into her professional rhythm now, the familiar patterns of assessment and advice. It was easier this way. Easier to think about square footage and comparable sales than about the way Vincent kept looking at her, the way his hand had brushed hers when he handed her the coffee cup, the way every room they walked through was layered with memories she couldn't quite push away. They moved through the dining room, original crown molding, hardwood floors that needed refinishing, the living room, good natural light, a fireplace that would need inspection but appeared functional, the small half bath off the hallway, dated fixtures, easy update. Vincent provided commentary where he could, and Grace took pictures on her phone and asked questions and pretended she was just doing her job. But when they reached the staircase to the second floor, she hesitated. "We can skip the upstairs if you want," Vincent said quietly. "I know this is a lot. The bedrooms are nothing special, just the master, a guest room, and a bathroom that probably hasn't been updated since the 80s. Grace shook her head. "No, I should see everything. If you're thinking about selling, buyers will want to know what they're getting into." She paused. "But maybe we could take a break first. I saw a coffee maker in the kitchen." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. But Vincent nodded, something like relief flickering across his face, and led her back to the kitchen. They sat at the kitchen table with fresh cups of coffee, the morning light slanting through the windows and catching the dust motes drifting in the air. Grace wrapped her hands around her mug and let the warmth seep into her palms. Vincent sat across from her, in the same spot he'd occupied last night, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said finally. "Anything. Why did you wait so long to come back? Not just for this." She gestured vaguely at the house around them. "But ever. You've been gone 16 years, Vincent. You never visited, not even for Christmas. Eddie May used to mention it sometimes, how much she missed you, how she wished you'd come home more often." The question hung in the air between them, heavier than she'd intended. Vincent's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt, of pain, of something she couldn't quite name. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Or maybe I do know, and I just don't want to admit it." He stared down at his coffee, turning the mug in his hands. "It was easier to stay away. Every time I thought about coming back, I thought about—" He stopped, his jaw tightened. "Thought about what?" Grace asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "You." The word came out rough, almost harsh. "I thought about you, Grace, every single time. I'd think about booking a flight home for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and then I'd think about running into you at the grocery store or the diner or the Christmas Eve service at church. And I couldn't." He shook his head. "I couldn't figure out how to do that, how to see you and pretend I was okay, how to make small talk about the weather when all I wanted was—" He cut himself off again, but this time his eyes lifted to meet hers, and Grace felt the impact of his gaze like a physical thing, like a hand pressed against her chest, pushing all the air out of her lungs. "All you wanted was what?" she whispered. Vincent held her gaze for a long moment. She watched him weigh his words, watched him decide how much truth to tell. "Everything," he said finally. "I wanted everything, Grace. I wanted to ask why you let me go. I wanted to tell you I never stopped thinking about you. I wanted to know if you ever thought about me, if you ever regretted." He broke off with a sound that was almost a laugh, bitter and sad. "But I was too scared to ask, so I just stayed away. Told myself it was easier. Told myself I'd gotten over you. Had you? The question came out before she could stop it. Gotten over me? Vincent looked at her across his mother's kitchen table, morning light catching the silver in his hair, grief and longing written across his face in equal measure. No, he said simply, not even close. The silence that followed was the loudest Grace had ever heard. She should say something. She knew she should say something. Something comforting, something wise, something that would make this moment less terrifying and more manageable. But her throat had closed up, and her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples, and all she could think was, he never stopped loving me. He never stopped, all this time. I'm sorry, Vincent said, misreading her silence. That was too much. I shouldn't have. We barely just reconnected, and here I am dumping 16 years of... I never stopped either. The words tumbled out, raw and unplanned, and Grace watched them land on Vincent like stones dropped into still water. His whole body went still. His eyes widened. What? I never stopped thinking about you. Her voice was shaking now, but she couldn't seem to stop. I told myself I had. I dated other people. I got engaged. I built a whole life. But there was always this space, this Vincent-shaped space that no one else could fill. And I kept waiting for it to close up, for time to heal it or whatever, but it never did. It just stayed, this hollow place in the middle of everything. She was crying. She hadn't realized until now, but there were tears sliding down her cheeks, and Vincent was staring at her like she'd just turned his whole world upside down. Grace, I thought I was doing the right thing. The words kept coming, a flood she couldn't dam. When you left for Georgia Tech, I thought if I really loved you, I'd let you go. I'd give you the chance to have a big life, a successful life, without me holding you back. You were so smart, Vincent. So talented. And I was just a girl from a small town who'd never been anywhere or done anything. I thought you'd outgrow me. I thought you'd go off to college and meet someone better and forget all about me, and I couldn't bear the thought of watching it happen. So I just... Let me go first, he finished quietly. Grace nodded, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. I told myself it was brave, selfless, but it wasn't. I was just scared, terrified. And instead of fighting for us, I let you walk away. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed back from the table and came around to her side, crouching down beside her chair so they were at eye level. His hand found hers, his fingers threading through hers the way they used to, the way they'd done 1,000 times when they were young. Gracie, he said softly, I need to show you something. He led her upstairs to the guest room that had once been his bedroom. The walls had been repainted since she'd last seen it, a neutral beige instead of the navy blue she remembered, and the furniture was different, impersonal. But there was a closet in the corner, and Vincent went to it, reaching up to the top shelf to pull down a small cardboard box. My mother kept this, he said, sitting down on the edge of the bed and setting the box in his lap. I found it yesterday, when I was going through her things. I'd forgotten it existed. Grace sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. Her heart was still racing from the conversation downstairs, from the confession she'd made and the look in Vincent's eyes when he heard it. She didn't know what was in the box, but she could feel its significance like a change in air pressure. Vincent lifted the lid. Grace recognized the contents immediately. The photographs. God, she'd forgotten about those photographs. Vincent and Grace at the football game, sharing hot chocolate. Vincent and Grace at prom, her in the red dress she'd saved up for months to buy. Vincent and Grace on this very porch, squinting into the summer sun, young and hopeful and completely unaware of what was coming. I remember these, she said softly, reaching out to touch the edge of one photo. Your mom took this one. She kept teasing us about how cute we were. She kept everything. Vincent's voice was thick. The photos, the ticket stubs, He reached into the box and pulled out something else. A dried flower, its color faded to a pale ghost of pink. Your prom corsage. She pressed it in a book. Grace's breath caught. Vincent, there's something else. He set aside the corsage and reached into the box again, his hand closing around a folded piece of paper. I wrote this our senior year, the week before I left for college. I was going to give it to you, but I couldn't. I was too scared. He held out the paper to her, and Grace took it with trembling fingers. The paper was soft from age, the creases worn. She unfolded it carefully, handling it like the artifact it was. And then she read. Dear Grace, I've been trying to figure out how to say this for weeks, and I keep chickening out every time I see you. So I'm writing it down instead, because maybe that way I can actually get the words out. I know we said we were going to do the mature thing. I know we agreed that long distance would be too hard and we're too young to make promises we might not be able to keep. I know all of that. I know it's the smart decision. But I don't want to be smart. I want to be with you. I love you, Gracie. I've loved you since the first time you laughed at one of my dumb jokes in Mrs. Patterson's English class. I'll probably love you for the rest of my life. And I know that's a lot to say when we're only 18, but it's true, and I can't leave without telling you. Ask me to stay, please, or come with me, or just tell me that you want this as much as I do, and we'll figure the rest out together. I don't care about being practical. I don't care about being mature. I just care about you. I'm going to give you this letter tomorrow, or maybe the day after, or maybe I'll chicken out again and never give it to you at all. But at least I wrote it down. At least now it's real. I love you. Vincent. Grace read the letter twice. Then a third time, the words blurring through fresh tears. Her hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled. I never knew, she whispered. Vincent, you never said. I know. His voice was rough with emotion. I carried that letter in my pocket for a week. I kept waiting for the right moment, and the right moment never came. And then I was standing in the driveway saying goodbye, and you were crying, and I thought. He swallowed hard. I thought if you wanted me to stay, you would have asked. The same way you thought if I wanted to stay, I would have said so. Grace looked up at him, the letter still clutched in her hands. We were both waiting for the other person to fight. Yeah. Vincent's smile was sad, and neither of us did, so we both lost. The weight of it pressed down on her. All those years, all that silence, built on a misunderstanding that could have been cleared up with one honest conversation. If she'd asked him to stay, if he'd given her this letter, if either of them had been brave enough to say what they really felt instead of hiding behind the safety of doing the mature thing. But they hadn't, and you couldn't go back. You could only go forward. Vincent, Grace said slowly, her mind spinning with everything she'd just learned. Why are you showing me this now? He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face like he was memorizing it. Because I'm tired of being scared. Because I've spent 16 years regretting that I never gave you this letter, and I don't want to spend the next 16 regretting that I didn't tell you the truth when I had the chance. He reached out and gently took the letter from her hands, setting it aside. Then he took her hands in his, holding them between them like something precious. I love you, Gracie. I never stopped. And I know it's been 16 years, and we're different people now, and maybe this is crazy. But when you showed up on my doorstep last night, I felt something I haven't felt in. He shook his head. I don't know. Forever, maybe. What did you feel? She asked, even though she already knew, even though she'd felt it too. Hope, Vincent said simply. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt hope. Grace looked at him, this man who had been a boy she loved, who had grown into someone she didn't know and somehow still recognized. His hands were warm around hers. His eyes were steady on her face, and in his expression, she saw everything she'd been afraid to want. A future, a partnership, a love that had survived 16 years of silence and was still impossibly alive. She didn't have words. She didn't need them. She leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss started soft, tentative, questioning, a conversation in the language they'd always spoken best. Vincent's lips were gentle against hers, his hands releasing hers to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears still damp on her cheeks. He kissed her like he was asking permission, like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. Grace answered by sliding her hands up his chest to the back of his neck, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss until it became something else entirely. Not a question anymore, an answer, a declaration. 16 years of longing poured into a single point of contact. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Vincent's forehead rested against hers, his eyes still closed, a look of wonder on his face that made Grace's heart turn over in her chest. "Wow," he said. Grace laughed, a watery, overwhelmed sound that was half sob and half joy. "Yeah, wow. Can we do that again?" "Yes, definitely yes." He kissed her again, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. This kiss was hungry, urgent, making up for lost time. Grace felt herself melting into him, her body remembering the shape of his even after all these years, fitting against him like she'd never left. They kissed until they were dizzy with it, until they had to break apart just to breathe. Vincent pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her, and Grace let herself be held. Let herself feel safe and wanted and home in a way she hadn't felt since she was 18 years old. "I can't believe this is happening," she murmured against his shoulder. "Me neither." His hand stroked up and down her back, a soothing rhythm. "I keep expecting to wake up. If this is a dream, I don't want to know." He laughed softly, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Agreed." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other in the quiet of the guest room, the box of memories open beside them on the bed. Outside, the winter sun had broken through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light through the window. It felt like a blessing, like the universe was giving them permission to start over. Eventually, reluctantly, Grace pulled back. "We should probably talk about this." "Probably," Vincent agreed, though he didn't let go of her entirely. His hands settled on her waist, keeping her close. "Any particular aspect you want to start with?" "Well, for starters," Grace took a breath, trying to organize the chaos of her thoughts. "You live in Seattle. I live here. That's a pretty significant logistical issue." "Not as significant as you might think." Vincent's expression turned serious. "I've been thinking about it since I got back. My job is remote, has been for 2 years now. I can work from anywhere with decent internet. And this house," he gestured around them. "It needs work, but it's solid. It could be a home again, if I had a reason to stay." Grace's heart stuttered. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I don't want to leave." His eyes held hers, steady and sure. "I've spent 16 years running from this town because it reminded me of you, but you're the only reason I'd want to be anywhere. So if you're here, if there's even a chance of us, then this is where I want to be." "Vincent." Her voice cracked on his name. "You can't make a decision like that based on one kiss. We barely know each other anymore. We're not the same people we were in high school." "I know that." He reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch impossibly gentle. "I'm not saying we have to figure everything out right now. I'm not proposing marriage or asking you to move in or any of that. I'm just saying, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And I'd like the chance to get to know the person you've become, if you'll let me." Grace looked at him, this man who had been her first love, who was looking at her now like she was his last hope, and felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, coiled in her chest, but underneath it, pushing through like a flower through concrete, was something stronger, hope. The same hope he'd described feeling when she showed up on his doorstep. "Okay," she said. Vincent's face lit up. "Okay? Okay, let's try. Let's get to know each other again. Take it slow. See what happens." She smiled, and it felt like the sun coming out. "I'm not going anywhere either." He kissed her again, quick and joyful, a celebration, and Grace laughed against his lips, feeling lighter than she had in years. Maybe this was crazy. Maybe they were setting themselves up for heartbreak. But for the first time in 16 years, she didn't care about being practical or sensible or safe. She just wanted to be happy. And right now, in this moment, she was. They spent the rest of the morning walking through the house together, but the professional assessment had fallen by the wayside. Instead, they wandered from room to room, trading memories and stories, filling in the gaps of each other's lives. Vincent told her about Seattle, the apartment with the water view, the job that challenged his mind but left him lonely, the string of relationships that never quite fit. Grace told him about her work, her clients, the satisfaction of helping people find their homes. She told him about David, too, the engagement, the realization, the ring she still kept in her desk drawer, like a reminder of what happened when you said yes to the wrong question. "I think I knew from the beginning it wasn't right," she admitted as they stood in the living room, looking out at the winter bare backyard. But I wanted it to be. I wanted to want him the way he wanted me. Does that make sense? More than you know. Vincent stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. I've done the same thing, dated people who were perfect on paper and wondered why I couldn't make myself feel what I was supposed to feel. And now? He was quiet for a moment. Then his arms came around her from behind, wrapping her in warmth, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Now I don't have to wonder anymore. Around noon, they realized they were starving. The remains of Rochelle's casserole were still in the fridge, but neither of them wanted to stay in the house any longer. The emotional weight of the morning had left them both drained, and the idea of being out in the world, of being seen together, of making their reunion real, felt necessary somehow. Rochelle's diner? Vincent suggested. Grace grinned. Prepare yourself. The whole town is going to know about this by dinner. Let them know. He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I'm not hiding. Not anymore. They walked to the diner, hand in hand, through streets decorated for Christmas, past neighbors who waved and did double takes and immediately pulled out their phones. Grace could practically see the text messages flying. Did you see Grace Holloway holding hands with the Aldridge boy? The one who left? They're back together. Call me. She didn't care. Let them talk. Let the whole town know. She was done pretending she didn't want this. Rochelle's old-fashioned diner was packed with the lunch crowd, every booth and table filled with people seeking comfort food and holiday cheer. The bells over the door jingled as they walked in, and Grace felt the room's attention shift toward them like a physical thing. Conversations paused, heads turned. Someone in the back made a sound that might have been a gasp. Malachi looked up from behind the counter, saw them, and broke into a wide grin. Well, 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 look what the Christmas spirit dragged in. Hush, Amy said, swatting her husband's arm as she emerged from the kitchen. But she was smiling too, her eyes bright with delight. You two come sit down. I've got the corner booth open. The corner booth. The good one. The one with the view of the square, where Malachi and Amy had been saving seats for them without even knowing they'd need them. Grace slid into the booth, and Vincent slid in beside her. Not across from her, but next to her, close enough that their shoulders touched. It was a statement, a declaration. Anyone looking at them could see exactly what was happening. Amy appeared with menus and water glasses, her smile knowing. Take your time. The peppermint hot chocolate is extra good today if you're interested. 2, please, Vincent said. And whatever the lunch special is, coming right up. Amy winked at Grace as she turned away, and Grace felt her cheeks flush. So much for taking it slow, she murmured. Vincent laughed. In Sweetgum Meadows, we never had a chance. He was right, of course. By the time their hot chocolates arrived, piled high with whipped cream and crushed candy cane, Grace had already spotted Mrs. Zhang peering through the window from across the street, hey, phone pressed to her ear. Rochelle herself would probably hear about this within the hour. By tonight, it would be the only topic of conversation in town. But sitting here with Vincent, their hands intertwined under the table, watching the Christmas lights twinkle on Main Street, Grace couldn't bring herself to mind. Let them talk. Let them celebrate. Let the whole town see that the lonely girl who sold everyone else their dream homes had finally found her way home too. Merry Christmas Eve, Vincent said, lifting his hot chocolate in a mock toast. Grace laughed and clinked her mug against his. Merry Christmas Eve. And in the corner booth of Rochelle's old-fashioned diner, surrounded by the warmth and bustle of a town that had known them both since birth, Grace Holloway and Vincent Aldridge began again.
Chapter 4. The hot chocolate was perfect. The company was better. Vincent sat in the corner booth of Rochelle's old-fashioned diner, with Grace pressed warm against his side, and for the first time in 16 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The lunch crowd swirled around them, familiar faces he half remembered, curious glances he pretended not to notice, but none of it mattered. What mattered was the woman beside him, her hand in his under the table, her laugh bright and easy as she told him about the time she'd accidentally shown a house to a family while a raccoon was living in the attic. It came down the stairs in the middle of my sales pitch, she said, her eyes dancing with the memory. just walked right into the living room like it owned the place. The wife screamed so loud I think they heard it 3 blocks over. Did they buy the house? They did, actually. After we evicted the raccoon, they said any house that came with that much excitement had to be worth it. She shook her head, still smiling. I sent them a housewarming gift with a little stuffed raccoon. They thought it was hilarious. Vincent laughed, the sound surprising him. He'd forgotten what it felt like to laugh like this, freely, without the weight of loneliness pressing down on his chest. You always knew how to turn a disaster into a story. It's a survival skill. When you've been in real estate as long as I have, you learn that the worst showings make the best anecdotes. Grace took a sip of her hot chocolate, leaving a small smudge of whipped cream on her upper lip. She wiped it away with her napkin, but not before Vincent had to resist the urge to kiss it off. Slow, he reminded himself. They'd agreed to take it slow. Even if every instinct in his body was screaming at him to hold her closer, kiss her longer, make up for 16 years of lost time in a single afternoon. Their food arrived. Rochelle's famous chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes and gravy, a lunch special that Vincent remembered from his teenage years. The first bite transported him back to high school, to afternoons spent in this very booth with Grace across from him, stealing fries off each other's plates and dreaming about futures that had seemed impossibly far away. Those futures were here now. Different than they'd imagined, harder in some ways and emptier in others. But maybe, just maybe, they could still build something worth having. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said, setting down her fork. "Anything." "This morning when you showed me the letter," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "you said you were tired of being scared, but you also said you're thinking about staying in Sweetgum Meadows, moving back permanently." Her eyes searched his face. "Are you sure that's what you want, not just because of us or whatever this is, but because it's actually right for you?" It was a fair question, a practical question, the kind of question Grace would ask, because she'd always been the one who thought things through while he charged ahead on instinct and emotion. Vincent took a moment to consider his answer. He owed her honesty. Real honesty, not just the romantic declarations that came so easily now that the dam had broken. "I've been asking myself that since I got here," he admitted. "At first, I told myself I was just here to handle Mama's affairs, clean out the house, decide what to do with it, tie up the loose ends, get in and get out before the holidays, before I had to face Christmas in this town without her. But you stayed. I stayed." He looked down at his plate, pushing a bit of mashed potato around with his fork. "Every day I told myself I'd book a flight back to Seattle, and every day I found a reason not to. The house needed more work than I expected. There were more boxes to go through. The weather was bad, or the flights were expensive, or—" He shook his head. "Excuses. They were all excuses. The truth is, I didn't want to leave." "Why not?" "Because Seattle doesn't feel like home anymore. I'm not sure it ever did." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I've spent 16 years building a life there. Good job, nice apartment, all the things you're supposed to want, but I never felt settled, never felt like I belonged. I'd come home from work to an empty apartment and wonder what the point of it all was. Who was I working so hard for? What was I building toward?" Grace was quiet, listening. Her hand tightened around his under the table. "When Mama died," Vincent continued, "it forced me to ask those questions for real. And I didn't like the answers. I was 34 years old with nothing to show for it except a 401k and a furniture set I bought from a catalog. No family. No community. No one who would notice if I just disappeared." "That's not true," Grace said softly. "People would notice. Your coworkers, your friends." "Coworkers, sure. They'd have to find someone to cover my projects." He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "Friends, I don't know, Gracie. I have people I grab drinks with sometimes. People I know from the gym or the coffee shop. But real friends, the kind who show up when things get hard, I'm not sure I have those anymore. I'm not sure I ever let myself have them." "Why not?" The question cut to the heart of something Vincent had never fully examined. He sat with it for a moment, letting himself feel the weight of it before he answered. "Because getting close to people means risking losing them," he said finally. "And I'd already lost everyone who mattered. My dad, when I was 11, You, when I was 18, and then Mama, this year. He swallowed hard. Every time I started to let someone in, I'd think about how much it hurt to lose the people I loved. And I'd pull back, keep things surface level, tell myself I was fine on my own. Grace's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Oh, Vincent, I know it sounds pathetic. The poor lonely guy who can't let anyone get close because he's too scared of getting hurt. He attempted a self-deprecating smile that didn't quite land. But it's the truth. And being back here in this town, in that house, it's made me realize I don't want to live like that anymore. I don't want to spend the next 16 years the same way I spent the last 16. Successful and safe and completely alone. So what do you want? Vincent looked at her, really looked, taking in every detail of her face. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there in high school, the determined set of her jaw, the warmth in her expression, the openness, the vulnerability she was showing him even though she had every reason to be guarded. I want to come home, he said. I want to fix up Mama's house and learn how to cook her recipes and fill the rooms with life again. I want to be part of this community, really part of it, not just passing through. I want to watch the Christmas tree lighting every year and eat pancakes at this diner and actually know my neighbors' names. He paused, his heart hammering in his chest. And I want to see where this goes, with us. I want to do it right this time. Grace was silent for a long moment. Then she leaned over and kissed him, right there in the middle of the crowded diner, soft and sweet and full of promise. When she pulled back, her smile was like sunrise. I want that too, she said. They finished their lunch in a happy daze, trading bites of food and stories and lingering looks that made Vincent feel like a teenager again. Amy refilled their coffee cups 3 times, each visit accompanied by a knowing smile and a not-so-subtle thumbs up. Malachi stopped by to chat about the Christmas Eve candlelight walk that evening, mentioning casually that the weather was supposed to be perfect, cold but clear, maybe a little snow. You should come, he said, directing the suggestion at Vincent but glancing meaningfully at Grace. The whole town turns out. It's really something special. I remember, Vincent said. I went every year when I was a kid. Then you know. Starts at 7, right in the square. Mrs. Zhang's handing out candles, same as always. Malachi grinned. I hear she's been asking about you, by the way. Apparently she has opinions about, well, you know how she is. Vincent did know. The entire town knew. Mrs. Zhang's opinions were legendary, and her dedication to matchmaking was matched only by her dedication to gossip. Between her and Rochelle, there wasn't a romance in Sweetgum Meadows that didn't have their fingerprints on it somewhere. Tell her I'll be there, Vincent said, and that I'm grateful for the nudge she gave me at the restaurant last night. Malachi's eyebrows rose. She nudged you? Mentioned Grace's name approximately 15 times in a 5-minute conversation. Vincent smiled. Subtle as a freight train, that woman. That's Mrs. Zhang for you. Malachi laughed and clapped Vincent on the shoulder. Welcome home, man. It's good to have you back. As Malachi walked away to tend to other customers, Vincent felt something warm unfurl in his chest. Such a simple phrase, welcome home, but it landed differently now than it would have a week ago. A week ago, he'd been a visitor, a ghost from the town's past, here only to settle his mother's affairs and leave. Now he was something else, something more. He was someone who might stay. After lunch, they walked through town hand in hand, taking the long way back to the Aldridge house. Grace pointed out the changes since he'd left. New businesses that had opened, old ones that had closed, the renovated storefronts and the stubborn holdouts that looked exactly the same as they had in 1995. The hardware store was still the hardware store. The bookshop on the corner still had the same crooked awning. Sweet and spicy Chinese Palace still anchored the end of Main Street, its red lanterns glowing even in daylight. But there were new additions, too. A coffee shop that served fancy lattes and avocado toast, an abomination, in Vincent's opinion, though he kept that to himself. A yoga studio where the old barbershop used to be. A craft brewery in the converted warehouse behind the square, apparently quite popular with the younger crowd. The town's growing, Grace explained as they paused to look at the brewery's festive window display, a Christmas tree made entirely of empty beer bottles. Slowly, but it's happening. People are moving here from Atlanta, from Macon, looking for something quieter, more affordable. I've sold more houses in the last 2 years than in the 5 years before that combined. That's good for business. It is, she smiled, but there was something complicated in her expression. It's also changing things. The town I grew up in isn't quite the same town anymore. Some of the new people don't understand the way things work here. The rhythms, the traditions. They want to speed everything up, make it more efficient, more modern. And you don't? I don't know. Grace sighed, leaning into him as they walked. I love progress. I love seeing the town thrive. But I also love the things that make Sweetgum Meadows what it is. The candlelight walk, the Founders' Day parade, the way everyone knows everyone and nothing stays secret for more than about 10 minutes. She laughed softly. I want it to grow, but I don't want it to lose itself in the process. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. Vincent squeezed her hand. It's like the house, Mama's house. I want to fix it up, make it modern, but I don't want to erase everything she put into it. I want to honor what was there while making room for something new. Grace looked up at him, her brown eyes soft. That's exactly it. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, past the church where his mother had sung in the choir, past the elementary school where they'd both learned to read, past the little park where they'd sit on the swings and talk a lifetime ago. Do you ever think about how different things would have been? Grace asked as they paused at the edge of the park, looking at the old oak tree where generations of Sweetgum Meadows kids had carved their initials. If we'd made different choices back then? Vincent found the spot on the tree where he'd carved their initials their junior year, VA plus GH, in slightly lopsided letters, surrounded by a crooked heart. The bark had grown over it somewhat, softening the edges, but it was still visible, still there after all this time. All the time, he admitted. I used to drive myself crazy with it. What if I'd given you the letter? What if you'd asked me to stay? What if we'd tried the long-distance thing instead of just giving up? And I eventually realized it didn't matter. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. We can't change the past, Gracie. We can only learn from it. And what I learned is that I was too scared to fight for what I wanted. I let fear make my decisions for me, and I regretted it every single day for 16 years. So what's different now? Now I'm more scared of losing you again than I am of anything else. He lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. Whatever happens, I'm going to fight for this. For us. I'm going to say the things I should have said 16 years ago, and do the things I should have done, and if it all falls apart anyway, at least I'll know I tried. Grace's eyes glistened. Vincent, you don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I'm not asking for promises or commitments or any of that. I just wanted you to know where I stand. I'm all in, Gracie, whatever that means, however long it takes. She didn't say anything. Instead, she rose up on her toes and kissed him, her hands fisting in the front of his jacket, pulling him closer. The kiss was deeper than the one in the diner, more urgent, and Vincent lost himself in it completely. The taste of her, the feel of her, the 16 years of longing finally finding somewhere to go. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing hard and Grace was smiling with tears on her cheeks. I'm all in too, she said. Just so you know. Vincent laughed, a sound of pure joy, and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. Around them, the winter afternoon was fading toward dusk, the sky turning soft shades of pink and gold. In a few hours, the town would gather for the candlelight walk, and they would be there together, holding candles in each other, watching the lights flicker against the falling snow. But for now, this moment was enough. More than enough. For now, they were home. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the Aldridge house, tackling some of the smaller tasks Vincent had been avoiding. Grace helped him sort through the kitchen cabinets, separating the items worth keeping from the ones that could be donated. She had a practical eye for it. Years of helping clients stage houses had taught her what was clutter and what was treasure, and she made the work feel lighter somehow, less like dismantling his mother's life and more like honoring it. This is beautiful, she said, holding up a ceramic mixing bowl painted with blue flowers. Is it handmade? My grandmother made it, Mama's mother. She was a potter before she got sick. Vincent took the bowl carefully, turning it in his hands. I remember her using this when I was really little. She'd let me stir the batter when she made cornbread. You should keep it. Yeah. He set the bowl aside in the small but growing pile of things he couldn't let go of. I should. They worked through the afternoon, taking breaks for coffee and conversation, gradually filling boxes for donation and boxes for keeping. Grace told him about her plans for the holidays. She'd been invited to 3 different Christmas dinners but hadn't committed to any of them, and Vincent told her about the Christmases he'd spent in Seattle, usually alone, sometimes with work friends who didn't have anywhere else to go. That sounds lonely, Grace said softly. It was. He shrugged, trying to make it seem like less than it was. But I got used to it. You can get used to almost anything if you do it long enough. That doesn't make it okay. No, it doesn't. He looked at her across the kitchen, this woman who had somehow walked back into his life at exactly the moment he needed her most. But maybe it's over now. Maybe I don't have to get used to being alone anymore. Grace crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. Vincent held her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the warmth of her body against his. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. In a couple of hours, they'd walk to the town square for the candlelight service. But right now, this was all he needed. "Come to Christmas dinner with me," Grace said, her voice muffled against his sweater. Vincent blinked. "What?" She pulled back to look up at him, her expression hopeful and nervous. "I've been invited to dinner at Rochelle and Benjamin's. It's going to be a whole thing. Malachi and Amy will be there, and Mrs. Zhang and her husband, and probably half the town. Rochelle's been planning it for weeks." She bit her lip. "I wasn't going to go. I was going to make some excuse about being tired, stay home with a bottle of wine and a movie. But if you're here, if we're doing this..." "I'd love to," Vincent said before she could finish. "Yes, absolutely yes." Grace's face lit up. "Really? Really?" He kissed her forehead, her nose, the corner of her mouth. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do than spend Christmas with you." She laughed, a sound of pure delight, and kissed him properly. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, the kitchen was dim with evening shadows and the first stars were appearing in the window. "We should get ready for the candlelight walk," Grace said reluctantly. "If we're late, Mrs. Zhang will never let us hear the end of it." "Can't have that." Vincent released her with one final squeeze. "You want to freshen up here, or head to your place?" "I should probably go home and change. I've been wearing the same clothes since this morning, and Rochelle's diner has a strict no chicken fried steak smell policy for formal events." She grinned at his confused expression. "I'm kidding, but I do want to put on something nicer. It's Christmas Eve." "Okay, I'll pick you up at your apartment at 6:30. It's a date." She kissed him one more time, quick and sweet, then headed for the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at him. "Vincent? Yeah? Thank you for showing me the letter, for telling me the truth about everything." Her voice was soft, sincere. "I know it wasn't easy." "It was the easiest thing I've ever done," he said honestly, "because it was you." She smiled, that radiant, sunrise smile that had been undoing him since they were 14 years old. And then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving Vincent alone in his mother's kitchen with a heart so full he thought it might burst. He showered and changed quickly, choosing his nicest sweater, a deep burgundy that his mother had given him 2 Christmases ago, and the good jeans he'd almost forgotten to pack. He ran a comb through his hair, dabbed on some of the cologne he hadn't worn since arriving in town, and examined himself critically in the bathroom mirror. Not bad, he decided. A little tired, still carrying the shadows of grief under his eyes, but lighter somehow. Like some of the weight he'd been carrying had finally been set down. He was nervous, he realized. Genuinely, absurdly nervous, the way he'd been before his first date with Grace back in high school. His palms were sweating, his heart was racing. He'd picked her up 100 times for 100 different occasions, and somehow this felt like the first time all over again. Maybe because it was. Maybe because everything they'd been to each other before was prologue, and tonight was the first page of something new. At 6:15, he grabbed his jacket and headed out into the cold. The walk to Grace's apartment took him through the heart of downtown, past storefronts glittering with Christmas lights and streets already starting to fill with people heading toward the square. He nodded at familiar faces, exchanged holiday greetings with people he half remembered, and marveled at how easily the rhythms of small-town life came back to him. In Seattle, he could go weeks without seeing a familiar face. The city was too big, too anonymous, too full of people moving past each other without connection. Here, you couldn't walk 10 feet without running into someone who wanted to chat about the weather, or ask after your mama, or remind you about the time you accidentally set off the fire alarm in the 5th grade. He'd forgotten how much he missed it, the groundedness of being known, the comfort of belonging to a place that remembered you even when you'd been away for 16 years. Grace's apartment was above the old hardware store on Main Street, a prime location, she'd told him, close to everything and with a perfect view of the square. He climbed the narrow staircase to the 2nd floor and knocked on her door, his heart hammering ridiculously hard. When she opened it, all the breath left his body. She was wearing a deep green dress that fell just below her knees, simple but elegant, with a neckline that showed off her collarbone and sleeves that ended just above her elbows. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves past her shoulders, and she'd put on a little more makeup than usual, subtle but enough to make her brown eyes seem impossibly bright. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Hi," she said, a little breathless. "Hi." He couldn't stop staring. God, Gracie, you look incredible." She smiled, color rising to her cheeks. "You clean up pretty well yourself." Vincent stepped closer, lifting one hand to touch the wave of her hair, letting his fingers trail down to her shoulder. "I mean it. You're stunning. You were always beautiful, but now I'm 34 with crow's feet and gray hairs I have to cover up every 6 weeks. Now you're a woman who knows who she is and what she wants." He cupped her face in his hands, looking into her eyes. "That's the most attractive thing in the world." Grace's expression softened. She turned her head to press a kiss against his palm. "Sweet talker. I'm just telling the truth." She smiled and stepped back, reaching for her coat. "We should go. The walk starts in 20 minutes, and Mrs. Zhang will definitely notice if we're late." "Right, the walk." Vincent helped her into her coat, unable to resist pressing a kiss to the nape of her neck as he did so. She shivered, and he filed that reaction away for future reference. "I've got to admit I'm a little nervous. About the candlelight walk? About being seen, with you, by the entire town." He took her hand as they headed down the stairs. "I know we're not trying to hide anything, but that's a lot of attention." Grace laughed, squeezing his hand. "Honey, the entire town already knows. Amy texted me an hour ago to say that Mrs. Patterson is already planning our wedding. She's put us down for the church in June." "June?" Vincent nearly tripped on the bottom step. We haven't even June? Welcome back to Sweetgum Meadows." Grace's eyes danced with amusement, where everyone assumes they know your business better than you do, and they're usually right. The town square was transformed. Vincent had seen it decorated for Christmas before, had grown up with these traditions, taken them for granted the way you take for granted anything that's always been there. But seeing it now, after 16 years away, felt like seeing it for the first time. The big tree in the center of the square was lit with thousands of white lights, its branches heavy with ornaments collected over decades. Some were handmade by schoolchildren, construction paper and glitter faded by time. Some were donated by local businesses, tiny replicas of storefronts and landmarks. Some were memorial ornaments, placed in honor of residents who had passed. Vincent wondered if there was one for his mother yet, or if that tradition only happened after the first Christmas without someone. Around the tree, luminarias lined the walkways, paper bags filled with sand and candles casting a warm glow across the snow-dusted ground. Garlands wrapped the lampposts, and wreaths hung from every storefront door. Christmas music played softly from speakers hidden somewhere. Not carols, not yet, but gentle instrumental versions of holiday songs, creating an atmosphere of expectation. And everywhere there were people. Families bundled in coats and scarves, couples holding hands, children darting between adult legs in excitement. The whole town turning out for a tradition that had been happening for as long as anyone could remember. "There you are!" Mrs. Zhang appeared from the crowd, her face bright with satisfaction as she took in their joined hands. "I knew you'd come. I knew it. Didn't I say, Chung? Didn't I say they'd come together?" Mr. Zhang, trailing behind his wife with the patient expression of a man who had long ago accepted his fate, nodded agreeably. "You did say that, dear." "I did. I said, mark my words, those two belong together, and all they need is a little push." Mrs. Zhang beamed at them. "And here you are, together, on Christmas Eve." "Mrs. Zhang," Grace began. "Don't you Mrs. Zhang me, Grace Holloway. I've known you since you were in diapers, and I've known this one since he was stealing cookies from my kitchen when he thought I wasn't looking." She pointed at Vincent, who had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was looking, I always saw, and I always knew you two were meant to be." "Thank you," Vincent said, because it seemed like the right thing to say. "For the push, and for, mentioning Grace's name 15 times at dinner the other night." Mrs. Zhang waved a dismissive hand. 15 times. I mentioned her 30 times at least. You were too busy moping to notice half of them." She thrust 2 white taper candles into their hands. "Now go. Find a good spot. The walk starts in 10 minutes, and you'll want to be near the front." She bustled away before they could respond, already moving toward the next arrivals with her armload of candles and her inexhaustible supply of opinions. "She's terrifying," Vincent said. "She's wonderful," Grace corrected. "And she's right about everything, which is the really annoying part." They found a spot near the big tree, close enough to see the minister who would lead the processional, far enough from the main crowd to have a little privacy. Other couples and families filled in around them, voices hushed with anticipation, candle flames beginning to flicker as people lit them from their neighbors. Vincent looked around at the gathering crowd and felt a swell of emotion he couldn't quite name. Homecoming, maybe. Belonging. The sense of being part of something larger than himself, woven into the fabric of a community that had known him since birth. His mother should be here. She'd never missed a candlelight walk in her life, not even the year she'd had pneumonia and had to be wheeled out in a wheelchair. She'd loved this tradition, loved the songs and the candles and the way the whole town came together in the darkness, creating light. "You okay?" Grace asked softly, reading his expression. "Yeah." He blinked away the sudden sting of tears. "Just thinking about Mama. She would have loved seeing this, seeing us." Grace leaned into him, wrapping her arm through his. "She does see, wherever she is. I believe that." Vincent wanted to believe it too. He'd never been much for religion, had drifted away from church in his years away from Sweetgum Meadows, but standing here in the glow of 1,000 candles, surrounded by the community his mother had loved, he could almost feel her presence. A warmth that had nothing to do with the crowd, a sense of approval, of blessing. "Go on." He could almost hear her say, "Be happy. It's what I always wanted for you." "Okay, everyone." Pastor Williams had taken his position at the front of the crowd, his own candle casting flickering light across his weathered face. "Welcome to our annual Christmas Eve candlelight walk. For those of you who are new to our tradition," his eyes seemed to find Vincent in the crowd, and he smiled slightly. "Or for those who've been away for a while, here's how it works." The minister explained the route, a processional around the square, pausing at 4 points to read scripture and sing carols, ending back at the tree for a final hymn and benediction. The walk had been happening in Sweetgum Meadows since 1923, started by the founding families as a way to bring the community together on the night before Christmas. "Let us remember," Pastor Williams said, "that we walk in darkness not because we are lost, but because we are seeking. We carry these small lights as a reminder that even the smallest flame can push back the shadows, and we walk together because the journey is always easier when we don't walk alone." He raised his candle high, and the crowd followed suit, a sea of tiny flames reaching toward the winter sky. "Let us walk," he said, "and let us remember." The processional moved slowly through the square, voices rising in carols that Vincent remembered from childhood. "O come, all ye faithful, silent night. Hark, the herald angels sing." The melodies wrapped around him like a blanket, familiar and comforting, pulling him back through time to all the Christmas Eves he'd spent in this exact spot with his mother's hand in his. Grace walked beside him, her shoulder brushing his, her candle flame dancing in the cold air. She knew all the words to every carol. Of course she did, she'd never left, and her voice was clear and sweet, harmonizing with the crowd. Vincent found himself singing too, the words coming back to him from some deep place of memory, rising to meet hers. At the first station, they paused while a reader recited scripture. At the second, the children's choir from the elementary school sang a wavering but enthusiastic rendition of Away in a Manger. At the third, an elderly woman Vincent vaguely recognized. Mrs. Patterson, maybe. The English teacher who'd despaired of ever teaching him to appreciate Shakespeare, read a poem about light in the darkness. And through it all, Grace was there, warm at his side, her hand finding his in the candlelit darkness, her smile luminous when she caught him looking at her instead of watching the proceedings. They were near the back of the processional, which meant they had a view of the whole crowd spread out before them. Hundreds of people, hundreds of candles, a river of light flowing through the winter night. Snow had begun to fall, soft, fat flakes that drifted down like blessings, catching the candlelight and turning the air itself to gold. "It's beautiful," Vincent murmured. "I forgot how beautiful it is." "It's my favorite night of the year," Grace said. "It has been ever since I was a little girl. There's something about all of us being here together, in the dark, making light. It feels like magic, like anything is possible." "Anything is possible." He squeezed her hand. "I'm starting to believe that." The processional reached its final station, back at the big tree, and the crowd gathered in a loose circle. Pastor Williams raised his candle one more time and the congregation fell silent. "Let us close," he said, with the words of the prophet Isaiah. "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone." He paused, letting the words settle. Tonight we are those people. Tonight we walk in darkness together, carrying our small flames, trusting that the light we carry is enough. And tomorrow, Christmas morning, we will wake to find that the darkness has been pushed back once more, that hope has been renewed, that love has found its way. His eyes swept the crowd, seeming to see each person individually. Whatever darkness you carry this Christmas, grief, loneliness, fear, regret, know that you do not carry it alone. Know that your light matters. Know that you are seen and known and loved. Vincent felt the tears spill over, running warm down his cold cheeks. He didn't bother to wipe them away. Beside him, Grace was crying too. She pressed closer to him, and he wrapped his free arm around her, pulling her against his side. They stood like that as the final hymn began, joy to the world, the crowd's voices rising in jubilant harmony, and Vincent let himself feel all of it. The grief for his mother, the wonder of finding Grace again, the hope that maybe, finally, after all these years, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. When the hymn ended and the crowd began to disperse, no one moved for a long moment. The snow continued to fall, the candles continued to flicker, and in the quiet that followed the music, Vincent could have sworn he heard his mother's voice, clear and sweet, singing one last note into the winter night. "Well done, baby. Well done." The walk home was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The snow was falling more heavily now, blanketing the streets in white, muffling the sounds of cars and conversation. The world felt hushed, sacred, set apart from ordinary time. At Grace's apartment building, Vincent walked her up the stairs, neither of them quite ready to say good night. At her door, she turned to face him, her cheeks pink from the cold, snowflakes melting in her hair. She shook her head, searching for words. "I don't know, it felt different this year. Special. It was special." Vincent stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You made it special. You helped." She smiled up at him, and he saw his own emotions reflected in her eyes, the joy, the wonder, the sense of something momentous unfolding. "I'm really glad you're here, Vincent. I'm really glad you came back." "Me too." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the melted snowflakes on her cheeks. "I should have come back years ago. I should have never left in the first place." "You had to leave." Her voice was soft. "We both know that. You had to go build your life, figure out who you were, become the person you are now." "And who is that?" Grace considered the question, her brown eyes searching his face. Someone who knows what matters. Someone who's not afraid to say what he feels. Someone who came home to bury his mother and found... She hesitated. Found what? Everything. Her voice cracked slightly on the word. Found everything, Vincent. Found home. Found me. He kissed her then, unable to wait another second. The kiss was different from the others. Deeper, more certain, a promise sealed in the falling snow. Grace's arms came around his neck, pulling him closer, and for a long moment there was nothing in the world but the two of them. The warmth of her body against his, the soft sound of her breath, the rapid beating of both their hearts. When they finally broke apart, neither spoke for a moment. They stood in the circle of each other's arms, foreheads touching, breath mingling in the cold air. "Stay," Grace whispered. "Tonight. Not like that, just stay. I don't want to be alone on Christmas Eve, and I don't want you to be alone either." Vincent pulled back to look at her, making sure he understood. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She took his hand and opened her apartment door. "Come inside, Vincent. Come home." He followed her in. Grace's apartment was warm and welcoming, lit by the soft glow of a Christmas tree in the corner and candles scattered on every surface. She took his coat and hung it beside hers, then disappeared into the kitchen to open a bottle of wine while Vincent looked around at the space she'd built for herself. It was lovely, he thought. Carefully curated, tastefully decorated, full of small personal touches that told him who she was. Books stacked on every available surface, plants thriving in the window, a gallery wall of photographs, friends, family, landscapes from trips she'd taken, a cozy reading nook by the window with a worn velvet chair and a hand-knitted blanket. But there was also something lonely about it, something that spoke of a life carefully constructed for one. The single coffee mug by the sink. The bed visible through the bedroom door made with military precision. The way everything was arranged just so, as if she needed to impose order on the emptiness. He recognized that loneliness. He'd been living with it for years. Wine? Grace appeared at his elbow, holding out a glass of red. "Thank you." He took it, and they settled onto the couch together, facing the Christmas tree. The lights twinkled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall. "I love Christmas Eve," Grace said after a moment. "More than Christmas Day, honestly. There's something about the anticipation, the waiting. Everything feels possible on Christmas Eve. And on Christmas Day? On Christmas Day, you find out what you actually got." She smiled wryly. "Which is sometimes wonderful and sometimes disappointing, but never quite as magical as the hoping." Vincent considered this. What if Christmas Day could be different this year? What if the reality was actually as good as the hoping? Grace turned to look at him, something flickering in her eyes. "Is that what you think is happening? With us?" "I think..." He set down his wineglass and took her hands. "I think I spent 16 years hoping for something I was convinced I could never have. And now, suddenly, impossibly, it's right here in front of me. And I'm terrified that I'm going to wake up tomorrow and find out it was all a dream." "It's not a dream." Grace's voice was fierce. "This is real, Vincent. We're real. Whatever happens next, and I don't know what that is, neither of us does. But this, right now, this is as real as it gets." "Then stay with me," he said. "Not just tonight. Stay with me tomorrow. Come to Rochelle's dinner. Meet me on the other side of Christmas morning. Let me prove to you that the reality can be as good as the hoping." Grace stared at him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet, and Vincent felt something in his chest finally settle into place. "I already said I'd come to Rochelle's dinner." She reminded him when they broke apart. "I know, but I wanted to ask again. I wanted you to know I meant it." "I know you meant it." She curled into his side, resting her head on his shoulder. "You always mean what you say. It's one of the things I love about you. Love." The word hung in the air between them, neither of them quite addressing it directly. It was too soon for that, maybe. They'd only been back in each other's lives for 2 days. But it was there, shimmering just beneath the surface, waiting for its moment. Vincent pressed a kiss to the top of her head and pulled her closer. "Merry Christmas Eve, Gracie." "Merry Christmas Eve, Vincent." They stayed like that for a long time, watching the snow fall past the window, the Christmas tree lights reflecting in the glass. Eventually, Grace's breathing slowed and her body relaxed into sleep, her weight warm and trusting against him. Vincent didn't move. He just held her, watching the candles burn down to stubs, feeling more at peace than he had in years. At some point, he must have fallen asleep too, because the next thing he knew, soft gray light was filtering through the windows and church bells were ringing in the distance. Christmas morning had arrived, and for the first time in 16 years, Vincent Aldridge wasn't alone.
Chapter 5. Grace woke to the sound of church bells. For a moment, she was disoriented. The light was wrong, filtering in from a different angle than usual, and there was a warmth pressed against her back that her sleep-fuzzy brain couldn't quite identify. She blinked at the Christmas tree in the corner of her living room, its lights still twinkling softly, and tried to piece together where she was and why she wasn't in her bed. Then the warmth shifted, and an arm tightened around her waist, and everything came rushing back. Vincent. They'd fallen asleep on the couch. She was still wearing her green dress, now hopelessly wrinkled, and her feet were tangled with his under the knitted throw blanket she kept on the back of the sofa. At some point in the night, they'd shifted to lie down, her back pressed against his chest, his arm wrapped around her like he was afraid she might slip away. She hadn't slept this well in years. Grace lay still for a moment, not wanting to wake him, savoring the simple miracle of not being alone on Christmas morning. The church bells continued their pealing, First Baptist she recognized, calling the faithful to the early service. And outside her window, the world was blanketed in white. The snow had continued through the night, transforming Sweetgum Meadows into a postcard, a snow globe, a perfect Christmas dream. Behind her, Vincent stirred. His arm tightened, then relaxed, and she felt his breath warm against the back of her neck. "Gracie?" His voice was rough with sleep, uncertain. We're on my couch," she said softly. "We fell asleep. It's Christmas morning." A pause. Then she felt him relax, tension draining from his body. "Christmas morning. Right." Another pause. "Hi." She smiled, her heart full to bursting. "Hi yourself. I didn't dream it." His voice was wondering. The candlelight walk, the snow, you. Not a dream. She rolled over carefully, turning in his arms until they were face to face. His hair was mussed from sleep, pressed flat on one side and sticking up on the other. There was a crease on his cheek from the throw pillow. His eyes were soft and warm, and looking at her like she was the sunrise. "Merry Christmas, Gracie," he said. "Merry Christmas, Vincent." He kissed her then, morning breath and all, neither of them caring, and Grace melted into it, into him, into this impossible, wonderful, terrifying thing that was happening between them. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Coffee," she said. "I need coffee, and then we need to figure out what we're doing today." "I thought we were going to Rochelle's for dinner." "We are, but that's not until 4. Grace sat up reluctantly, running her fingers through her tangled hair. "Which means we have the whole day ahead of us. Any requests?" Vincent propped himself up on one elbow, looking at her with an expression that made her stomach flutter. "Actually, yeah. I was thinking, if you're up for it, we could go to Mama's house. Make her coconut cake." He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "She made it every Christmas. It was tradition. And I found the recipe in her recipe box, and I thought, maybe we could?" "Yes." Grace didn't need to hear the rest. "Yes, absolutely. Let's do it." His face lit up, and she felt that flutter in her stomach again, stronger this time, spreading through her whole body like warmth. She was falling in love with him. She'd probably never stopped being in love with him. And for the first time in 16 years, that didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt like coming home. An hour later, showered and changed and fortified with coffee, they made their way through the snow-covered streets to the Aldridge house. The world was hushed and beautiful, the way it always was after a heavy snowfall. The plows hadn't come through yet, so they walked down the middle of the street, their boots leaving the first prints in the pristine white blanket. Christmas lights still glowed from porches and windows, brave splashes of color against the monochrome landscape. Somewhere nearby, children were already outside, their shrieks of delight carrying through the cold air as they tested out new sleds and built the first snowmen of the day. Grace had changed into jeans and a cozy cream sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Vincent was wearing the same burgundy sweater from last night. He'd have to go home to change before dinner, but he looked more relaxed than she'd seen him since he arrived in town. The grief was still there, a shadow in his eyes, but it was softer now, mixed with something else, something that looked like hope. "I used to love Christmas mornings," he said as they walked, his gloved hand wrapped around hers. "When I was a kid, I'd wake up at 5 a.m. and just lie there, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if it was too early to wake up Mama. She had a rule, no presents until 7, but she always came into my room at 6:30 anyway, because she knew I was dying." "That sounds like Eddie May." Grace smiled at the image. "She never could resist spoiling you." She really couldn't. His voice was fond, sad, loving all at once. "The last few years after she got sick, I tried to come home for Christmas, made it twice, but work was always so busy and the flights were so expensive," and he shook his head. "Excuses. They were all excuses. I should have been here more. You're here now." "Yeah." He squeezed her hand. "I'm here now." The Aldridge house looked different in the morning light, blanketed in snow, the white lights on the porch railing still glowing faintly. Someone, a neighbor maybe, or one of the church ladies who'd been checking in, had shoveled the front walk, leaving a clean path to the door. Inside, the house was cold, the heating having been turned down overnight. Vincent adjusted the thermostat while Grace wandered into the kitchen, looking around at the space where they'd sat just 2 nights ago, where everything had changed. "Okay," Vincent said, joining her with Eddie May's handwritten recipe card in his hand. "Coconut cake. How hard can it be?" Grace looked at the recipe, 3 layers, homemade frosting, fresh coconut, and then looked at Vincent's hopeful, slightly terrified expression. "We're going to need more eggs," she said. 2 hours later, the kitchen was a disaster zone. Flour covered every surface, including Vincent's hair and Grace's left cheek. The first batch of frosting had seized into an unusable lump and been scraped into the trash. One of the cake layers had stuck to the pan and had to be carefully reconstructed like a jigsaw puzzle. The coconut, fresh, as Eddie May's recipe demanded, had proven nearly impossible to crack open, requiring a hammer, a screwdriver, and language that would have made the church ladies blush. But the cake was assembled. 3 layers, slightly lopsided, covered in fluffy white frosting and showered with shredded coconut. It sat on Eddie May's crystal cake stand, looking improbable and beautiful and somehow exactly right. "We did it," Grace said, staring at their creation with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "We actually did it." "We did it." Vincent was grinning, a streak of frosting on his chin. "It's not perfect. Mama's was always perfect, but—" "It's wonderful," Grace said firmly. "It's absolutely wonderful, and she would be so proud of you." Vincent's grin faltered, and for a moment she saw the grief rise up in his eyes. But then he blinked, and it settled back down, and he reached for her hand. "She would have loved this," he said quietly. "Loved seeing us here in her kitchen, making her recipe. Loved knowing that." He paused, swallowed. "That I'm not alone anymore." Grace stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, and for a long moment they just stood there in the flour-dusted kitchen, the imperfect cake watching over them, the winter sun streaming through the window. "You're not alone," she said against his chest. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" "Promise." He pulled back to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Gracie?" He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. "These last 2 days have been, I don't even know how to describe it, like waking up from a dream I didn't know I was having, like finding something I didn't know I'd lost." "I know." She reached up to touch his face, her thumb brushing the streak of frosting from his chin. "I feel it, too. I meant what I said yesterday, about staying, about wanting to see where this goes." He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "But I need you to know, it's not just about us, it's about everything. The town, the house, the life I want to build. You're part of it, a huge part. But even if this doesn't work out." "Vincent, let me finish." His eyes were intense, earnest. "Even if this doesn't work out, I'm staying. I'm coming home. because I've spent 16 years running from the only place I ever belonged, and I'm tired. I'm so tired, Gracie. I want to plant roots. I want to know my neighbors. I want to wake up on Christmas morning and hear church bells and smell snow and feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. That's exactly what I want too, what I've always wanted. She took a shaky breath. I was too scared to admit it, too scared to want something that might not happen. And now, she looked at him. This man who had been her first love, who had somehow become her second chance, and felt the last of her fear dissolve. Now I'm not scared anymore, she said. Now I'm just happy. Really, truly happy. For the first time in I don't even know how long. Vincent's smile was like the sun coming out. He pulled her close and kissed her, slow and sweet, tasting of frosting and coffee and something that felt a lot like forever. When they finally broke apart, they were both laughing, giddy and ridiculous, and covered in flour. We should clean up, Grace said, looking around at the devastation. And you need to change before dinner. True. Vincent sighed, surveying the flowery chaos. Rochelle would have a fit if I showed up to her Christmas dinner looking like this. Rochelle would take pictures and frame them on the wall of the B&B. Grace grinned. But let's not give her the satisfaction. They cleaned the kitchen together, working in easy tandem, bumping hips and stealing kisses as they washed dishes and wiped counters. The cake was carefully covered and set aside, ready to be transported to the dinner. The recipe card was placed back in Eddie May's recipe box, with a small notation added in Vincent's handwriting. Made this with Grace, Christmas 2025. Not as good as Mama's, but close. By the time they were finished, the afternoon light was fading toward dusk, and it was time to get ready for the celebration. The Sweetgum bed and breakfast was glowing when they arrived. Rochelle and Benjamin had outdone themselves. The historic Victorian was draped in lights, white along the roofline, colored around the windows, icicle strands dripping from the wraparound porch. Luminarias lined the walkway, flickering warmly in the blue winter dusk. Through the windows, Grace could see the dining room ablaze with candlelight, the long table already set with Rochelle's best china and crystal. Wow, Vincent said, stopping on the sidewalk to take it in. Rochelle doesn't do anything halfway. Grace shifted the cake carrier in her arms. Wait until you see inside. They climbed the porch steps together, and before they could knock, the door flew open and Rochelle appeared, resplendent in a red velvet dress and the biggest smile Grace had ever seen on her face. There you are. Come in. Come in. You'll catch your death out there. She ushered them inside, taking the cake carrier from Grace with practiced ease. Oh, look at this beautiful cake. Did you make this together? Of course you did. Mrs. Zhang. Come look at this cake. Mrs. Zhang materialized from somewhere deeper in the house, Mr. Chung trailing behind her with a glass of wine in each hand. Her eyes went straight to Grace and Vincent's joined hands, and her face split into a grin of pure triumph. I told you, she crowed. I told you they were meant to be together. Didn't I say it? The first day he came into the restaurant, I said to Chung, those two are going to end up together. Mark my words. Didn't I say that? You said that, Mr. Chung confirmed placidly, and here they are, together, on Christmas. Mrs. Zhang looked like she might actually burst with satisfaction. Eddie May is smiling down from heaven right now, I know it. She always wanted this. She told me so many times. If only Vincent would come home. If only he and Grace could find their way back to each other. Grace felt Vincent's hand tighten around hers. She said that? All the time, honey, all the time. Mrs. Zhang's expression softened. She loved you both so much, and she would be so happy to see you here together. Before either of them could respond, more guests arrived, and the house filled with warmth and noise and the chaotic joy of a Sweetgum Meadows Christmas gathering. Malachi and Amy came in from the cold, stamping snow off their boots and carrying covered dishes that smelled incredible. Pastor Williams arrived with his wife, Nat, both of them beaming at the sight of Vincent. A stream of other familiar faces followed, neighbors and friends and church members, all of them eager to welcome the prodigal son home and to congratulate Grace on finally finding happiness. Is it always like this? Vincent murmured to Grace as they were swept along by the crowd toward the dining room. Pretty much. Rochelle's Christmas dinner is the event of the season. Everyone who's anyone gets an invitation. She squeezed his hand. The fact that she included you means you've been officially welcomed back into the fold. I'm not sure if I should be honored or terrified. Both. Definitely both. Dinner was a feast. The long table was laden with dishes that represented every tradition Sweetgum Meadows held dear. A massive glazed ham from the Brown family farm, Rochelle's famous cornbread dressing, Mrs. Zhang's special fried rice, her concession to fusion cuisine, sweet potato casserole with marshmallow topping, green beans cooked low and slow with bacon, cranberry sauce both canned and homemade, because, as Rochelle said, some people are heathens and that's okay, and a dozen other sides and salads and contributions from guests. At the center of the dessert table, Eddie Mae's coconut cake held a place of honor. Grace sat beside Vincent at the crowded table, their shoulders touching, their feet tangled together underneath. The conversation flowed around them. Stories and jokes and memories, gentle teasing and genuine warmth. And she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Decades, maybe. She felt like she belonged. It wasn't that she'd ever felt like an outsider in Sweetgum Meadows. She'd grown up here, built her life here, was well-liked and respected by everyone in town. But there was a difference, she realized now, between being liked and being known, between having a place and having a home. Being here with Vincent, having someone beside her who knew her history, who had been part of her story from the beginning, who looked at her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, filled a hole she hadn't even known was there. "You okay?" Vincent asked softly, his hand finding hers under the table. "Better than okay." She smiled at him, feeling tears threaten for about the 10th time that day. "This is, I don't know, perfect. This is perfect." It really is. After dinner, when the dishes had been cleared and the guests had migrated to the parlor with glasses of wine and slices of cake, Rochelle clinked her fork against her glass and called for everyone's attention. I know, you all want to get back to eating," she said, to a wave of good-natured laughter. "But I have something I want to say, and y'all are just going to have to listen." She waited until the room had quieted, her eyes sweeping the gathered faces before landing on Vincent. 16 years ago, she said, a young man left this town. He was smart and kind and full of promise, and we all knew he was going to do great things. And he did. He built a successful career, made a life for himself out in the world. She paused, but he also left behind something precious, someone precious. And for 16 years, I watched that someone put on a brave face and pretend everything was fine, while I knew, everyone knew, that there was a piece of her missing. Grace felt her face heat. Beside her, Vincent's hand tightened around hers. "Eddie Mae was my dear friend," Rochelle continued, her voice softening. "We sang together, we gossiped together, we prayed together for 40 years. And she never stopped hoping that her boy would come home. Never stopped believing that he and Grace would find their way back to each other." She raised her wine glass, and around the room, others did the same. "Eddie Mae isn't here to see this, but I like to think she knows anyway. I like to think she's looking down right now, seeing her son sitting next to the woman he loves, surrounded by people who care about both of them. And I like to think she's smiling." Rochelle's eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was steady. "To Eddie Mae," she said. "To homecomings. And to second chances." "To second chances," the room echoed. Grace felt the tears spill over as she raised her own glass. Beside her, Vincent was crying too, making no effort to hide it. Around the table, the people who had known them both since birth were smiling through their own tears, united in celebration of something that felt almost too good to be true. And then Vincent stood up. Grace looked up at him in surprise, but he was already speaking, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to thank you all," he said, addressing the room, "for welcoming me back, for looking after my mother when I wasn't here, for—" he glanced down at Grace, then back at the gathered faces, "for pushing me in the right direction, even when I didn't know I needed pushing." A ripple of soft laughter. Mrs. Zhang looked particularly pleased. "I left this town 16 years ago because I thought I had to. I thought success meant going somewhere else, being someone else. I thought I'd outgrow this place, these people, the life I had here." He shook his head. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. Because everywhere I went, every success I had, every life I tried to build, none of it felt like home. None of it felt like this. He reached down and took Grace's hand, pulling her gently to her feet beside him. "I'm not leaving again," he said, his voice strong and sure. "I'm staying in Sweetgum Meadows. I'm going to fix up my mother's house and learn how to make her recipes and be the kind of neighbor she would have wanted me to be. I'm going to show up for the candlelight walks and the Founders' Day parades and the Sunday services at First Baptist." His eyes found Grace's, and his voice softened. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for the 16 years I wasted being too scared to come home." The room erupted in applause. Mrs. Zhang was openly weeping. Rochelle was beaming so brightly she looked like she might explode. And Grace was looking at Vincent like he'd just handed her the world. "I love you," she said, too quietly for anyone else to hear. "I love you, Vincent. I never stopped." "I love you too, Gracie." He pulled her into his arms, right there in front of everyone, and kissed her with the pent-up longing of 16 years. "I never stopped either." Around them, the room dissolved into cheers and whistles and good-natured catcalls. Someone, probably Malachi, shouted something about getting a room. Someone else, definitely Mrs. Zhang, was already on the phone, presumably spreading the news to whoever hadn't managed to attend dinner. But Grace didn't notice any of it. She was too busy kissing the love of her life on Christmas night, surrounded by the people who had known them since childhood, in the town that had always been home even when it didn't feel like it. For the first time in 16 years, everything was exactly as it should be. Later, much later, after the cake had been eaten and the wine had been drunk, and the last of the guests had said their goodbyes, Grace and Vincent walked through the snow-covered streets to the Aldridge house. The night was clear and cold, the stars bright overhead. Their breath fogged in the winter air, and their footsteps were muffled by the fresh snow. The streets were quiet now, most of Sweetgum Meadows tucked in for the night, but the Christmas lights still glowed from porches and windows, turning the whole town into something out of a storybook. "I can't believe you said all that," Grace said, her arm looped through Vincent's, in front of everyone. "I meant all of it." "I know you did. That's what I can't believe." She shook her head, smiling. "The Vincent I knew in high school would never have stood up in front of a room full of people and made a declaration like that. He was too shy, too scared." "The Vincent you knew in high school made a lot of mistakes." He looked down at her, his expression serious. "He let fear make his decisions. He convinced himself that playing it safe was the same as being smart. And he lost the best thing that ever happened to him because he was too scared to fight for it." "Vincent, I'm not that person anymore." He stopped walking, turning to face her in the glow of a nearby streetlight. "Or maybe I am, but I'm trying to be better, braver. I'm tired of being scared, Gracie. I'm tired of playing it safe. I want to take risks. I want to say the things I mean. I want to live the kind of life my mother would be proud of." Grace reached up and touched his face, her gloved fingers gentle on his cold cheek. "She would be so proud of you. She is proud of you. Rochelle was right. She's watching. She knows." "You think so?" "I know so." She rose up on her toes and kissed him softly. "Now come on, let's go inside. It's freezing out here." The Aldridge house was cold when they entered, but Vincent quickly set about building a fire in the old stone fireplace, while Grace found blankets and made them both cups of hot tea. Within 20 minutes, the living room was transformed, warm and cozy, lit by firelight, the Christmas tree in the corner still twinkling with Eddie Mae's carefully preserved ornaments. They settled on the worn couch in front of the fire, Grace tucked against Vincent's side, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. Outside, the snow had started falling again, soft flakes drifting past the window, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and their own quiet breathing. "This is perfect," Grace said softly. "This whole day has been perfect." "It has." Vincent pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I keep waiting to wake up." "You keep saying that, because I keep meaning it." He tightened his arm around her. 2 days ago, I was alone in this house, drowning in grief, convinced I'd made a mess of my entire life. And now I have you. His voice was thick with emotion. Now I have hope. Now I have God, Gracie. I have everything. I have everything I ever wanted and a bunch of stuff I didn't even know I was missing." Grace shifted, turning so she could look at him. The firelight played across his face, catching the silver in his hair, the lines at the corners of his eyes, all the evidence of the years they'd spent apart. But underneath all of that, he was still Vincent. Still the boy who had loved her so fiercely it scared them both. Still the person she'd measured everyone else against, even when she didn't want to admit it. "I have everything too," she said. "I didn't know. I thought I was fine. I thought I'd built a good life, a happy life. But I was wrong. I was just surviving, just going through the motions." She reached up to touch his face. "And then you came back and everything changed. Everything suddenly made sense." "Gracie, I love you," she said. "I said it before, but I need to say it again. I love you, Vincent. I loved you when I was 18 and too scared to admit it. I loved you through 16 years of silence and distance. And I love you now, more than ever." Vincent stared at her, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you too. I love you so much it terrifies me. But I'm not going to let that stop me anymore. I'm not going to run." "Neither am I." He kissed her then, slowly at first, tenderly, like he was savoring every moment. But the kiss deepened, grew more urgent, until Grace was breathless with it, her hands fisted in his sweater, her body pressed against his. When they finally broke apart, they were both trembling. "Stay with me tonight," Vincent said, his forehead pressed against hers. We don't have to. I just want you here. I want to fall asleep with you and wake up with you and start figuring out what this life is going to look like." "Yes," Grace said. "Yes, to all of it." They didn't move from the couch. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the snow continued to fall outside the window. Grace lay with her head on Vincent's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling his fingers trace lazy patterns on her arm. The room smelled like wood smoke and evergreen and something that might have been the lingering sweetness of coconut cake. "What are you thinking about?" Vincent asked after a long silence. "The future," Grace said. "What it might look like." "What do you see?" She considered the question, letting her imagination unspool. "I see us renovating this house together, arguing about paint colors and cabinet hardware. I see Sunday dinners with Rochelle and Benjamin and summer barbecues with Malachi and Amy. I see Christmas mornings right here in this room with a fire going and snow falling outside and nowhere either of us needs to be." "That sounds perfect." "It does, doesn't it?" She smiled against his chest. "What do you see?" "I see you," Vincent said simply. "Whatever else happens, wherever the years take us, I just see you. Beside me. With me. For as long as you'll have me." Grace lifted her head to look at him. "That's going to be a very long time. I'm counting on it." She kissed him again, softer this time, a promise rather than a plea. And then she settled back against his chest, and he pulled the blanket tighter around them both, and they lay there together in the firelit darkness, watching the snow fall and the flames dance, feeling the warmth of each other and the warmth of home. Outside, Christmas night was settling over Sweetgum Meadows, quiet and peaceful and full of promise. In houses all over town, families were gathering around fires and opening late presents and telling each other stories. In the B&B, Rochelle was probably on the phone with Mrs. Zhang, planning the wedding neither Grace nor Vincent had mentioned yet. In the square, the big tree still glowed, its ornaments reflecting the starlight, keeping watch over the town the way it had for generations. And in the Aldridge house on Maple Street, two people who had spent 16 years being lonely had finally found their way back to each other. Grace felt Vincent's breathing slow, felt his body relax into sleep. She stayed awake a little longer, watching the fire, feeling the rise and fall of his chest beneath her cheek, marveling at the improbability of it all. What do the lonely do at Christmas? She thought. They find each other, they find home, they find hope, and if they're very, very lucky, they find love. Grace smiled into the darkness and closed her eyes. She wasn't lonely anymore. Epilogue. 1 year later. The Aldridge house had never looked more beautiful. Grace stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, a cup of mulled cider warming her hands, and watched the party unfold around her. The rooms were full of people, neighbors and friends, old faces and new. their laughter and conversation weaving together into a symphony of celebration. Christmas music played softly from the speakers Vincent had installed last spring, competing with the crackle of the fire and the occasional shriek of delight from the children playing in the front yard. The house itself was transformed. Over the past year, she and Vincent had poured their hearts into the renovation, stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, updating the kitchen while preserving its vintage charm. They'd painted the walls in warm, welcoming colors and filled the rooms with a mix of Eddie Mae's treasured pieces and new furniture they'd chosen together. The result was a home that honored the past while embracing the future, a home that felt, finally, like theirs. Grace looked down at her left hand, at the diamond ring that had been there since October. She still wasn't used to it, still caught herself staring at it in quiet moments, marveling at the way the light caught the stone, at what it represented. Vincent had proposed on a crisp fall evening under the sweetgum tree by the old football field, the same tree where he'd kissed her for the first time when they were 16. He'd gotten down on one knee in the fallen leaves and asked her to marry him, and she'd said yes before he even finished the question. The wedding was planned for June. Mrs. Zhang had already offered to cater. Rochelle had already claimed the right to host the bridal shower at the B&B. The whole town, it seemed, had opinions about flowers and venues and whether they should release butterflies or doves. Grace found she didn't mind. After 16 years of loneliness, it felt good to be surrounded by people who cared enough to meddle. There you are. Vincent appeared at her side, slipping an arm around her waist. He was wearing the burgundy sweater she loved, the one his mother had given him, the one he'd worn to their first Christmas dinner together, and his eyes were bright with happiness. "I've been looking for you. I was just taking it all in." She leaned into him, fitting against his side the way she always did, like they'd been designed for each other. "Can you believe this? A year ago, I was sitting alone in my apartment, dreading Christmas. And now you're hosting a party in the house you're renovating with your fiancé, surrounded by half the town." Vincent pressed a kiss to her temple. "Life comes at you fast. It really does." She turned in his arms, facing him. "Are you happy?" "Gracie." His voice was soft, wondering. "I'm so happy I don't even know what to do with it. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong, but it never does. Every day is just better, more than I ever thought I'd have." "Me too." She rose up to kiss him, soft and sweet, not caring who was watching. "Me too."
The party was in full swing, and Vincent couldn't stop smiling. He moved through the rooms of his mother's house, his house now, his and Grace's, accepting congratulations and catching up with people he'd known his whole life. Malachi pressed a fresh drink into his hand and clapped him on the shoulder. Mrs. Zhang cornered him by the Christmas tree to share her latest matchmaking triumph. The new librarian and the owner of the hardware store, apparently, though Vincent was only half listening. Rochelle swept through like a benevolent hurricane, adjusting decorations and refilling glasses and occasionally pausing to beam at him with undisguised satisfaction. "I knew it," she said, for approximately the 15th time. "I knew you two would end up together. Didn't I say it, Benjamin? The very first night when I sent Grace over with that casserole?" "You did say it, dear," Benjamin agreed mildly. He was a patient man. Vincent had learned. He had to be, married to Rochelle. "I had a feeling." Rochelle patted Vincent's cheek. "Call it women's intuition, call it divine inspiration, call it whatever you want, but I knew." Vincent didn't argue. There was no point arguing with Rochelle, and besides, she wasn't wrong. Whatever force had conspired to bring him and Grace back together, fate, divine intervention, or just a meddling network of small-town matchmakers, he was grateful for it. He found Grace in the kitchen, frosting sugar cookies with a group of children who had claimed her as their own. She was laughing at something one of them said, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. The silver bracelet he'd given her in high school glinted on her wrist, next to the engagement ring she'd been wearing for 2 months. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, and her smile widened. "Hey yourself, want a cookie?" Fair warning, Lily here is very particular about the sprinkle distribution. The little girl in question, Pastor Williams' granddaughter, Vincent thought, nodded solemnly. The sprinkles have to be even, otherwise it's wrong. Well, we can't have that. Vincent crossed to the counter and accepted a frosted star from Grace's outstretched hand. Looks perfect to me. Lily supervised. I can tell. They shared a look over the children's heads, a look full of warmth and amusement and the easy intimacy of a year spent building a life together. Vincent still marveled at how natural it felt, being with her. How every morning he woke up next to her felt like a gift. How every evening they spent on this couch, or in this kitchen, or in the garden they'd planted together in the spring, added another layer to the home they were creating. His mother would have loved this. He felt her presence sometimes, in the way the afternoon light fell through the kitchen window, in the scent of lavender that still lingered in the closets, in the coconut cake recipe they'd made together again this year. Better this time, though still not quite as good as Mama's. She was here, in everything they did, and Vincent carried her with him always. The carolers are starting soon, Grace said, wiping frosting from her fingers. Should we gather everyone in the living room? In a minute. Vincent reached for her hand, tugging her gently away from the cookie assembly line. I want to show you something first.
Vincent led her through the house to the front door, pausing only to grab their coats from the hook in the entryway. Grace followed willingly, curious but content to let him have his mystery. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the sky blazing with stars. Snow had fallen earlier in the day, covering the yard in a pristine white blanket that sparkled under the Christmas lights. The porch was strung with garlands and fairy lights, and the luminarias Rochelle had insisted on lined the walkway, flickering gently in the still air. Look, Vincent said, pointing toward the town square. Grace looked and caught her breath. The square was visible from here, just barely, through the bare branches of the trees that lined Maple Street. The big tree in the center was lit up like a beacon, its thousands of lights reflecting off the snow. And gathered around it, she could see tiny figures carrying candles, the Christmas Eve walk just beginning. The view from this porch, Vincent said softly. I never really appreciated it when I was a kid. But now, it's magical. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, taking it in. I used to walk past this house sometimes after you left. I'd look up at the windows and wonder what it would be like to live here, to be part of this family. And now you are. Vincent stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her from behind. This is your home, Gracie, our home, for as long as we want it. She leaned back against him, feeling his warmth, his solidity. I still can't believe it sometimes that this is real, that we got a second chance. We almost didn't. His voice was rough. I almost didn't come back. I almost sold the house without ever setting foot in it. And then Rochelle sent me over with a casserole. Best casserole of my life. Grace laughed, turning in his arms. I'll tell her you said that. She'll be insufferable for weeks. She's already insufferable, but she earned it. Vincent cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. She gave me back my life, Gracie. She gave me back you. No. Grace shook her head gently. We gave us back to us. We made the choice to try again, to be brave, to fight for what we wanted, instead of running from what we were afraid of. I love you, Vincent said, the words as natural as breathing. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. I already know it. Grace rose up on her toes and kissed him, slow and deep, pouring everything she felt into the contact. When they broke apart, they were both a little breathless. But I won't stop you from reminding me. From inside the house, they heard a burst of laughter, followed by the opening notes of Silent Night. The carolers had arrived, or maybe the party guests had started singing on their own. Either way, the music drifted out through the windows, mingling with the cold night air, creating something that felt sacred. We should go back in, Grace said reluctantly. They'll miss us. In a minute, Vincent pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin. Let me just hold you for a minute, before we have to share you with everyone else. Grace smiled against his chest. I'm not going anywhere. I know, he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. That's the best part. They stood like that as the stars wheeled overhead, and the candles flickered in the square, and the music swelled from inside the house. Around them, Sweetgum Meadows celebrated Christmas the way it always had, with light and love and the warmth of community. And on the porch of the Aldridge house, two people who had spent too many years apart held each other close and marveled at the improbability of their happiness. "Ready?" Grace asked finally, pulling back to look at him. "Ready." Vincent took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Let's go celebrate." They walked back into the house together, into the warmth and the laughter and the chaos of a Sweetgum Meadows Christmas. The fire crackled in the hearth. The tree glittered in the corner. Rochelle was already organizing everyone into caroling formation, and Mrs. Zhang was passing out lyric sheets, and Malachi was sneaking another slice of coconut cake from the kitchen. It was messy and loud and absolutely perfect. Grace looked around at the faces of the people she loved, the friends who had become family, the neighbors who had known her since birth, the man beside her who had found his way home after 16 years of wandering, and felt her heart overflow. This was what the lonely did at Christmas. They found each other. They built a home. They created a family, not just of blood, but of choice, of love, of the thousand small moments that added up to a life. And if they were very, very lucky, if they were brave enough to take the chance, they lived happily ever after. Grace squeezed Vincent's hand, and he squeezed back, and together they joined their voices with the chorus rising around them. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing Sweetgum Meadows in white. Inside, the music swelled and the fire crackled, and love, patient, enduring, finally found, burned brighter than any flame. This concludes What Do the Lonely Do at Christmas?, an African-American sweet romance novella written by Imani Price, narrated by Shatrice Williams and Michael Evans. Thank you so much for listening. To keep up with Imani's upcoming books, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and join her mailing list at imaniprice.com. Note from the author: if you especially enjoy my stories, please consider purchasing my books, which are available at all major retailers. You can also support my work here on YouTube by becoming a channel member through the Join button or by sending a super thanks by clicking on Thanks. Your support helps me continue offering these stories for free. Thank you again, and I truly hope you enjoyed this story.